Before the world had a name, before the first light dared to pierce the dark, before even silence had learned what it was to be silent, there was nothing. Not the nothing of an empty room, not the quiet stillness of a forest at midnight, but a nothing so total and so absolute that the word itself fails to carry its full weight. The ancient Greeks called it chaos. And chaos was not simply a void. It was not merely the absence of things. It was a presence all its own, a yawning, breathing, boundless depth that held within it the seed of everything that would ever exist. It was the first thing, and it was alone, and it had no edges, and it had no center, and it stretched in every direction that had not yet been invented, through time that had not yet begun. There is something deeply human about trying to imagine this moment. We are creatures of the daylight, of the hearth fire, of the warm and familiar world. And yet something in us reaches back, straining across the unimaginable distance, trying to feel what it would have been like to stand at the very edge of existence before existence had decided to begin. The Greeks reached back this same way, across the centuries, and what they found there, in that primordial darkness, was not a god with a plan. It was not an architect preparing blueprints for a grand design. It was simply this: the formless, the open, the endless. Chaos. The first fact of the universe. And then, as if the darkness itself had grown tired of being alone, something shifted. Something within the deep became aware of itself, and from that awareness, the first forms emerged. They did not arrive with ceremony. They did not announce themselves with thunder or light. They simply were, suddenly and completely, as though they had always been waiting just beneath the surface of that infinite dark. The first of these was Gaia, the earth. She did not fall from anywhere. She rose from chaos as though she had been called, as though the universe, in its first act of longing, had summoned the ground beneath all things. Gaia was not merely soil and stone. She was the foundation of reality itself, the first mother, the first surface upon which anything would ever stand or grow or die. Close behind her came Tartarus, the deep abyss that lay far below even the roots of the earth. If Gaia was the solid and the known, Tartarus was its opposite and its shadow, the place of ultimate depth, the darkness beneath the darkness, a prison at the bottom of all things that would one day hold the worst of what the cosmos could produce. And then came Eros, not the mischievous winged boy of later stories, but something older and far more fundamental. This first Eros was the force of desire itself, of connection and attraction, the pull that draws one thing toward another. Without Eros, nothing would ever join with anything else. Without this original longing, the universe would have remained a collection of separate and isolated things, forever drifting apart. Eros was the reason things came together. He was the reason the story could continue at all. From chaos, too, came Nyx, the goddess of night, and Erebus, the deep darkness of the underworld. These were not simple figures. Nyx was ancient beyond reckoning, so old and so vast that even the later gods, even Zeus in the full flower of his almighty power, would hesitate before crossing her. She was the mother of sleep and death, of dreams and strife, of the fates and the furies, and a dozen other forces that would reach their fingers into every corner of the world that was coming. She drove her chariot through the sky each evening, trailing her dark robes behind her, and the world beneath her did not tremble. It simply stilled itself, respectfully, as she passed. From Nyx and Erebus together came the first light. Ether, the bright upper air, the clear and shining atmosphere of the heavens, and Hemera, the day. This was the first great pairing, the first conversation between opposites, and already the pattern of the Greek universe was beginning to reveal itself. Light and dark, depth and surface, form and formlessness. These things did not destroy each other. They created each other. They needed each other. Day could not exist without night. The solid earth could not be understood except in contrast with the bottomless abyss beneath it. The Greeks understood this from the very beginning, and they built it into the bones of their mythology. Every force has its counterpart. Every creation carries the shadow of its own undoing. From Gaia, without a partner, without the warmth of another presence, drawing on nothing but the power of her own vast being, came Uranus, the sky. He arched above her, endless and blue, covering her completely, a canopy that stretched from one horizon to the other and beyond, past all horizons. He was the sky itself, the boundless ceiling of the world, and from the very moment of his creation, he looked down at Gaia and something in the universe recognized itself. The sky looked at the earth and saw, for the first time, a companion. A place where he ended and something else began. Gaia also brought forth Aria, the mountains, which rose from her body like an exhalation, like the earth stretching and sighing after the long sleep of chaos. And from her came Pontus, the sea, not the wild and personal sea of Poseidon, but the first and oldest sea, the primordial waters that surrounded the solid world, vast and deep and ancient even before the gods began their long wars. These were the first things. This was the world in its infancy, before it had been given its names, before anyone had lived in it and given it its stories. But the stage was set. The earth was beneath, the sky was above, the sea lapped at the edges of everything, and the darkness waited patiently at the margins, as it always would. And now Uranus and Gaia turned toward each other, and the first great family of the divine began. Their union was immense and complicated, as all the great unions of the gods would prove to be. From Gaia and Uranus came the 12 Titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters, beings of enormous power and extraordinary beauty, tall as mountains, with voices like the deep rumble of the earth moving beneath itself. The eldest of them was Oceanus, who was not simply a river, but the great world river, the freshwater stream that the ancient Greeks believed ran all the way around the disk of the earth, holding everything together in a slow and eternal circle. Oceanus was steady and patient, content in his vast circuit, and he would stand apart from the wars that followed, choosing neither side, continuing his endless journey around the edge of the world. His sister and wife was Tethys, and together they produced the 3,000 Oceanids, the nymphs of streams and rivers and springs, and 3,000 river gods, the divine spirits of every waterway in the known world. Then came Hyperion, whose name meant the one who travels above, and who is the Titan of heavenly light. He and his sister Thea were the parents of Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos the dawn, the rose-fingered goddess who opened the gates of heaven each morning to let her brother's chariot through. There was something beautiful in this, that the sun and moon and the first light of morning were children of the same parents, siblings sharing the great responsibility of lighting the world. Eos was among the most beloved of all divine figures, soft and blushing, scattered with the deep red of morning, and the Greeks loved her particularly because she was the moment of possibility, the pause between darkness and full day, when anything might still be true. Zeus was the Titan of intelligence, the inquisitive mind behind the stars, and his wife Phoebe was associated with the prophetic intellect, the cool and lunar wisdom. Their children would include Leto, who would carry within her the seeds of 2 of the greatest gods of Olympus. Crius was another of the great brothers, associated with the constellations and the movement of heavenly bodies, and Mnemosyne, whose name means memory, was one of the most quietly powerful beings in all of creation. For without memory nothing could be known, nothing could be passed down, nothing could survive the passage of time. She would eventually become the mother of the 9 muses, and, through them, the grandmother of all art and all knowledge. But of all the Titans, the 2 who would shape the world most profoundly were the youngest brothers, Cronus and Iapetus. Iapetus was the father of a remarkable and troubled family, Prometheus, Epimetheus, Atlas, and Menoetius. These 4 sons would each play their own part in the long drama of the world's becoming. Atlas would bear the sky upon his shoulders. Menoetius would fall in battle, proud and reckless, hurled down into Erebus. Epimetheus would act without thought and open the world to suffering. And Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, would be the great friend of humanity, the thief of heaven's fire, the one who would suffer more than any other for the crime of caring about the small and mortal creatures who crawled across the earth. And then there was Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, the most cunning, the most ambitious. Cronus, who would do what none of his brothers had dared, who would raise his hand against his own father and remake the world in a single act of terrible courage. But that story belongs to a moment still to come. Before the Titans, before Cronus could rise, Gaia and Uranus brought other children into the world, children far stranger and far less welcome than their divine siblings. These were the Cyclopes, three brothers named Brontes, Steropes, and Argesh, thunder, lightning, and brightness. They were enormous, powerful, and brilliant in their craft, with a single great eye sitting in the middle of each of their foreheads, and with hands made for shaping and building and forging things that lesser beings could not imagine. The Cyclopes were gifted beyond measure, but they were also alien in their appearance, and Uranus looked upon them with something less than love. More alarming still were the three Centimanes, the hundred-handed ones. Their names were Cottus, Briareos, and Gyges, and each of them had 50 heads and 100 hands, and the strength concentrated in those hands was beyond all measure. When Briareos moved through the water, the sea itself trembled and frothed. When Gyges threw a stone, it flew with the force of a mountain falling. They were not beautiful, and they were not gentle, and they were not meant to be either. They were the concentrated power of the primal world, the raw and unrefined force of nature before it had been tamed by thought or shaped by art. And Uranus looked at these children, the Cyclopes and the Centimanes, and something in him recoiled. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was disgust at what his own power had produced. Perhaps, in some part of himself that he did not examine too carefully, he feared that something so immense and so strong and so strange might one day threaten him. Whatever the reason, the sky god could not bring himself to accept these children as his own. He pushed them back. He forced them down, back into the body of the earth, back into the dark places beneath the surface where they could not be seen, where their groans and their raging would simply be absorbed by the stone and the deep soil. He imprisoned them inside their own mother. And Gaia felt this, as she felt everything, as the earth has always felt every sorrow that is pressed into it. She felt her children writhing beneath her skin, trapped in the hollow places beneath mountains, and the pain of it built in her the way pressure builds inside the earth before an earthquake, slowly, and then suddenly. She felt the injustice of it. She felt the cruelty of it. And Gaia began to think about what might be done. She shaped a weapon. Deep within herself, from the hardest material she could find, she fashioned a sickle, gray and gleaming, with a curved blade designed for a single, specific, necessary purpose. And then she went to her children, to the Titans, who lay across the slopes of the world and rested in the valleys and the high places, and she told them what had been done to their brothers. She told them about the darkness and the imprisonment and the pain. And then she offered them the sickle, and she asked them which of her sons was willing to do what needed to be done. The Titans were silent. One by one, they looked away. The eldest, the most powerful, the most respected, they all looked at the sickle and looked at the sky and found, somewhere within themselves, a reason not to take it. Only the youngest spoke. Only Cronus stepped forward from the line of brothers with his hand outstretched, his jaw set, his eyes holding nothing but determination. He took the sickle, and he hid himself away, and he waited. That night, when Uranus stretched himself across the earth to lie beside Gaia, as he had done every night since the first night of the world, Cronus emerged from his hiding place. He moved with purpose and without hesitation, for he had been preparing for this moment his entire life, had been sharpening his courage against the whetstone of injustice and waiting. He reached up into the sky, and the sickle flashed in the dark, and Uranus was unmade, not killed, for the sky cannot die, but unmade in a specific and devastating way, severed from his power to create. Exiled from the intimate union he had forced upon the earth without gentleness or restraint. From the blood that fell into the sea, things were born. The Furies arose, Alecto, Megira, and Tisiphone, the three avengers, the hounds of justice who would chase down those who shed the blood of family for the rest of time. Giants rose from the drops that fell on land, enormous and violent, who would one day wage their own war against the gods. And from the sea foam that gathered around what had been cast into the water, something impossibly beautiful began to form. The sea churned, and the foam thickened, and from that white turbulence there emerged Aphrodite, not born in the ordinary sense, but assembled by beauty itself out of the most basic materials of the world. She rose from the waves near the island of Cyprus, and she was the most beautiful thing that had ever existed, and the world knew it immediately, and everything that could feel desire felt it. Cronus heard this prophecy, and he put it somewhere deep inside himself where it could not be easily reached, and he turned away from it. He was the king of the world now. He was the ruler of the age of the Titans, and the sky above him was empty of its tyrant, and his brothers and sisters spread themselves across the kingdoms of the earth, and for a time, a long time, a golden time, an age that the poets would later look back on with an almost unbearable longing, the world knew a kind of peace. They called it the Golden Age. Humans were not yet a part of the world, but if they had been, they would have founded a place of extraordinary abundance. The earth gave its fruits freely. The rivers ran with wine and honey. The seasons were gentle and predictable. The light was constant and warm. This was the world as it was meant to be, perfect, balanced, supervised by beings of enormous wisdom and power who asked nothing of the earth but to sustain life and grow beautiful. Cronus ruled from his throne, with his wife Rhea, his own sister, as was the custom of the divine, for who else would have been worthy of him? Beside him, Rhea was the great mother, generous and warm and deeply earthly, and she brought to Cronus everything that had been missing in Uranus's cold and distant reign. Together they were the rulers of all things, and for a long time the world was glad of it. But the prophecy was still there. It lived in the back of Cronus's mind like a splinter he could not find, worrying at him, keeping him awake in the hours before dawn when the darkness was most complete and the silence most absolute. He would be overthrown. A child of his own blood would do it. The certainty of this would not leave him. And so when Rhea bore their first child, a daughter, beautiful and powerful, her eyes already ancient with a wisdom that had no business being in so new a face, Cronus did something that no parent should do. He swallowed her. The goddess Hestia, firstborn of the children of Rhea and Cronus, the goddess of the hearth and the sacred flame, went down into the darkness of her father's belly before she had drawn her second breath. And the next child, Demeter, the earth mother, she who would govern the growth of all crops and carry within herself the power of the harvest, followed her sister into the dark. Then Hera, who would become the queen of heaven, and Hades, who would become the lord of the dead, and Poseidon, who would rule the sea. Each of them, one after another, disappeared into their father's impossible hunger. It must be said clearly, this was not an act of love. It was not even an act of simple self-preservation. It was the act of a being so consumed by fear that he was willing to unmake the very thing he loved most, his own family, his own continuation, in order to hold on to what he had. Cronus had spent his whole life watching his father lose power through arrogance and cruelty. And now, finding himself in power, he was doing the same thing, choosing domination over connection, choosing control over love. The prophecy was not a fate he was avoiding by swallowing his children. It was a fate he was creating. Rhea watched, and with each child she bore, and with each child she lost, her grief deepened and her resolve hardened. When the sixth child came, when she felt within herself the familiar stirring of new life, the knowledge that another divine being was preparing to enter the world, she made a decision. She went to Gaia and Uranus, the grandparents of the coming child, and she asked them for help. They gave her wisdom, and they gave her a plan, and they sent her to the island of Crete. On Crete, in a deep cave on the slopes of Mount Ida, Rhea gave birth to a son. She held him for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight of him, to see his eyes, which were already too knowing, already too bright, already looking at the world with the expression of someone who understood, on some level, that the world was not quite right and that he was the one who would fix it, and then she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and carried it back to Cronus and offered it to him. And Cronus swallowed the stone and was satisfied. The child was taken to Crete and hidden deep in the cave of the nymphs. Amalthea, a divine goat, nursed him with her milk, a milk so nourishing that the horn that broke from her head became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, endlessly replenishing itself, the source of abundance for all time. The Curides, divine warriors, stood guard outside the cave, clashing their shields and their spears together whenever the child cried, so that the sound of the infant's voice would be lost in the noise, and Cronus, searching the world for any sign of his offspring, would find nothing. The child grew in secret. He grew in the cave, with the light coming down through cracks in the rock and the sound of the sea always present, somewhere in the distance. He grew with the nymphs and the divine goat and the warriors, and he grew without a father, without the presence of the being who should have been his first great guide and teacher. He grew instead into himself, into the truth of what he was, which was something the world had never seen before and would never see again, a god who had been raised not in the halls of heaven, but in the dirt and the darkness and the ordinary places of the world. A god who understood, in his bones, what it meant to be hidden, to be threatened, to be made small by someone else's fear. His name was Zeus. Zeus grew on Crete, and as he grew, the island grew with him. It seemed more vivid, more alive, more charged with whatever it is that the presence of a great destiny does to the air around it. He was restless and curious, and he spent his childhood learning the shape of the world, the way the wind moved over the mountain's face, the way the stars arranged themselves at different seasons, the way the sea changed color in the afternoon light, the way the goat's eyes held a kind of gentle wisdom that he found himself returning to again and again. He was learning what it meant to be alive in the world rather than above it. This education, this ordinary, grounded, deeply embodied education, would make him different from every divine ruler who had come before. But childhood ends, even for gods. And there came a time when Zeus looked out from the cave on Crete and felt within himself the full force of what he was, and understood that the world was not in the state it should be, and knew with the absolute certainty of a being who has never once doubted his own purpose that he was the one who needed to change it. He needed allies. He needed knowledge. He needed a plan. Some versions of the story tell of Métis, the Titaness of wisdom and cunning, who became Zeus's first great love and counselor. It was Métis who devised the method by which Cronus could be undone. She prepared a potion, or perhaps it was an emetic, or perhaps simply the right combination of divine persuasion and supernatural force, and she found a way to introduce it to Cronus. The great Titan king, who had swallowed his children whole and kept them alive within himself in some impossible divine suspension, drank what was offered to him, and the effect was immediate and violent and deeply satisfying. Up came the stone, first the stone that had been wrapped in swaddling clothes and presented as the infant Zeus so many years before. And then, one by one, the swallowed gods were released. Hestia emerged, and Demeter, and Hera, and Hades, and Poseidon, gods fully grown, fully formed, burning with the rage and the grief of the years spent imprisoned in the dark. They came into the world gasping and furious and whole. And Zeus was there to receive them. There was a moment, it must have been a strange and extraordinary one, when the 6 children of Cronus and Rhea stood together for the first time. 6 divine beings who shared the same blood and the same wound, who had been separated at the very beginning of their lives, who were now joined in purpose and in anger. They were not yet the great gods of Olympus. They had not yet claimed their domains or received their honors. They were simply a family, gathering itself together after a long and terrible separation, looking at each other across the short distance between them with eyes that held both recognition and the particular grief of all the years lost. Zeus looked at his brothers and sisters, and they looked at him, and the war began. It was not a war that started cleanly, with a declaration or a formal challenge. These things almost never do. It began with Zeus gathering his forces, reaching out to those who might have reason to oppose the Titans, making alliances, building a coalition of power that could stand against the oldest and most deeply rooted beings in the cosmos. He went to the Titans who had stayed neutral, who had watched Cronus's reign with something less than enthusiasm, and had kept themselves apart from the courts of power. He found those who had been wronged by the old order, those who had been pushed to the margins of the world. And he went to Tartarus. In the deep abyss, in the lightless prisons at the bottom of all things, the Cyclopes and the Centimanes were still confined. Uranus had put them there, and Cronus, who had claimed to free the world from Uranus's cruelty, had looked at the 100-handed ones and the 3 great one-eyed craftsmen, and had felt the same unease his father had felt, and had left them where they were. Zeus went to Tartarus, and he broke the prison open, and he freed them. The gratitude of the Cyclopes was not simply gratitude. It was the gratitude of master craftsmen given, for the first time, the chance to make something truly worthy of their abilities. They had spent ages in the dark, their hands unused, their minds turning over problems and solutions that had no materials to work with. Now, free, with their enormous fingers uncurling in the light, they turned all of that stored energy into creation. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt, not merely a weapon, but the symbol of everything he was and would become. It was made of storm and fire and the specific quality of light that splits the sky just before a great rain, and it fit in Zeus's hand as though it had been made for nothing else, which of course it had been. For Poseidon, they made the trident. 3-pronged and vast, it could shake the earth to its roots and trouble the deepest waters of the sea. It was a tool of immense destructive power, but also of creation. The same force that could break the ground open could also strike rock and cause a spring to well up, could stir the Dead Sea into life, could reshape the coastlines of the world. For Hades, they made the helmet of invisibility, the cap that could hide even a god from the sight of all others, that could make the Lord of the Dead move through the world like a shadow, present and absent at once, watched and unseen. 3 brothers, 3 gifts, 3 weapons that would define the shape of the divine order for all time. The world was dividing itself, clarifying, becoming the world we recognize. And the Centimanes, those 50-headed, 100-handed beings of impossible strength, took their place in Zeus's army with a quiet and devastating purpose. The Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, lasted 10 years. 10 years, in divine terms, is not a short time. The gods do not get tired in the way mortals do, and they do not give up easily, and the Titans who opposed Zeus were the oldest and most powerful beings in existence, Cronus at their head. With his brothers Hyperion and Ceus and Crius and Iapetus fighting beside him, and the mountains of Othrys as their stronghold, high and cold and ringed with the cold power of the old divine order. Zeus and his siblings took Mount Olympus. That great peak, which would become the home of the gods for all time, was their fortress and their home base, and from there they reached out with everything they had. The battles were not simply physical, they were geological, cosmic, existential. When the Titans and the Olympians clashed, the world shook. Mountains moved. The sea withdrew from the shore and then came crashing back. The sky itself groaned under the weight of the divine conflict being waged across its face. The thunder that Zeus threw cracked the sky open from one horizon to the other, and the light that came from it was not ordinary lightning, but something older and more terrible, the specific light of a universe deciding, violently and irrevocably, what kind of world it was going to be. For 9 years, the war was balanced. 9 years of destruction and renewal, of victories that meant nothing because the other side could always recover, of great single combats between beings of immeasurable power that left entire regions of the world scarred and emptied. 9 years of Gaia, watching her children destroy each other across the skin of her body, feeling each impact, each upheaval, each shattering of stone and tearing of earth as her own wound. In the 10th year, Zeus released the full force of his power. He let the thunderbolts fall continuously, one after another, and the light was so constant that the darkness of night vanished entirely, and the earth burned, and the sea boiled in its bed, and the heat reached all the way down to Tartarus and warmed even those unthinkable depths. And the Centimanes stepped forward. 100 hands each, 50 heads each, 3 of them working together, they reached into the earth and pulled up boulders, mountains, entire sections of the world's surface, and they hurled them at the Titans in a volley so continuous and so enormous that it was like the earth itself turning against the old order. The Titans broke. One by one, and then all at once, they broke, overwhelmed not merely by force, but by the accumulated weight of everything that was pushing the world toward a new age. They fled from Othrys. They fled from the high places they had held for centuries, and Zeus and his brothers drove them down, down through the layers of the earth, down past the roots of the mountains, down through the dark and the deeper dark until they reached Tartarus, the same abyss where the Cyclopes and the Centimanes had been imprisoned, the same darkness that had waited at the bottom of everything since the beginning. Into Tartarus went the Titans, into the deep place bounded by bronze walls and surrounded by the river Styx, guarded now by the Centimanes who took up their position at the doors with the grim patience of beings who had spent eternity in darkness themselves and knew exactly what it meant to be kept from the light. Cronus went there, and Hyperion, and Ceus, and Crius. Iapetus went there. The world of the Titans was over. It must be noted, in fairness to the story and to the complexity of the Greek imagination, that not all Titans were enemies. Oceanus had remained apart. Prometheus and Epimetheus, the sons of Iapetus, had sided with Zeus. Prometheus's gift of foresight had told him which side the future was on, and he had chosen accordingly. Themis, the Titaness of law and divine order, and her sister Mnemosyne, Memory herself, were not imprisoned. And Atlas, great, broad Atlas, received a punishment that was not imprisonment, but something in certain ways worse. He was set to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky upon his shoulders, forever. The divine weight of the heavens pressing down on him through all eternity. The war was over. The world was still. For the first time in 10 years, the earth stopped shaking, and the sea returned to its proper borders, and the sky cleared of the thunderclouds that had been piling up since the conflict began. The Olympians looked at each other across the quiet, smoke-touched air, and they understood that they had won, and that winning meant they now had to decide what to do with everything they had inherited. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades cast lots for the 3 great domains of the world, the sky, the sea, and the underworld. This was the great division, the fundamental sorting of divine power that would define the structure of existence for all time. Zeus drew the sky and the heavens, and the thunder became his permanent attribute, his signature, the thing that would follow him and announce him through all his long and complicated reign. Poseidon drew the sea, vast and deep and constantly in motion, a kingdom without walls or clear borders, full of creatures and currents and the specific loneliness of open water. And Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, the place beneath all places, the kingdom that was not diminished by its depth or its darkness, but that held within itself a kind of absolute and final power that the other realms could not match. The earth itself remained shared common ground, belonging to all gods and to the mortals who would eventually inhabit it. And the great mountain Olympus became the seat of the gods, the home of the Olympians, the place from which the divine order would govern the world. Now the gods arranged themselves. Hera became the queen of heaven, Zeus's wife, his equal in dignity if not always in power, the goddess of marriage and of women, of the bonds that tie families together and the fury that is unleashed when those bonds are violated. Hera was not a gentle goddess. She was regal and proud and absolutely sure of her own worth, and the long history of Zeus's infidelities would make her into something complicated and sometimes terrifying, a goddess of justice who sometimes chose her targets badly. A defender of the sacred institution of marriage whose own marriage was the most troubled in heaven. But she was magnificent, always, in her wrath and in her dignity, and the world respected her even when it feared her. Demeter took the earth, not the sky or the sea or the underworld, but the middle world, the growing world, the place where things push up from the dark soil and reach toward the light. She was the harvest and the fallow field and the specific grief of a mother whose child has been taken, and her story would become one of the most powerful and most beautiful stories the ancient world would ever produce. Athena, born in a way that defied all ordinary understanding, springing fully formed and in full armor from the head of Zeus himself, the result of Zeus swallowing her mother Métis, when prophecy warned that Métis's children would surpass their parents. Athena was the goddess of wisdom and of the particular kind of courage that comes from thinking clearly under pressure. She was a warrior, but she was a warrior who preferred justice to battle, strategy to brute force, the olive branch to the sword. She had her city, Athens, which she won in a contest with Poseidon by giving the people a gift more lasting than a salt spring, the olive tree, patient and enduring, source of oil and food and shade. Athena was the goddess of civilization itself. Apollo came next in the divine ordering, or perhaps simultaneously, as the gods do not arrange themselves in simple sequence, but exist all at once, their stories overlapping and interweaving. Apollo, the god of the sun, of music, of poetry, of prophecy, of the divine harmony that runs through all created things. He was Zeus's son by Leto, the Titaness, and his birth had been a difficult one. Hera's jealousy of Leto had ensured that. But Apollo had been born on the floating island of Delos, and from his first breath he had been extraordinary. He killed the great serpent Python at Delphi while still young, claiming that sacred place as his own and establishing there the oracle that would speak to the world through the voice of the Pythia, the Sibyl, the priestess, the woman who sat over the crack in the earth and breathed the vapors and spoke in riddles that contained all the future. Apollo's twin was Artemis, his sister in every sense, born on the same day, sharing his exile, sharing his mother's suffering. Artemis was the goddess of the hunt and of the moon, of wild places and wild animals, of the specific freedom that belongs to those who have not been tamed by domestic life. She was fierce and independent and deeply loyal to her own nature, and she asked of Zeus only one gift: to remain forever a maiden, free from the complications of love and marriage, free to run through the forests at night with her companions, free to be exactly what she was without the interference of anyone else's expectations. Zeus gave her this gladly, and she took it and made it into a kind of sacred independence that was entirely her own. Ares was the god of war, but not the noble, strategic, intelligent kind of warfare that Athena represented. Ares was the raw, bloody, overwhelming force of battle, the thing that happens in combat when all the planning falls away and there is only the immediate and animal reality of survival. He was not particularly loved, even among the gods. Zeus had little patience for him. Athena despised him. But he was powerful and he was necessary because the world contained war and the world's things needed divine custodians, and so Ares was given his domain and his privileges and left to be what he was, which was frequently a troublemaker and occasionally something genuinely terrible. Hephaestus was the god of the forge, and his story began with a rejection that would shadow everything that followed. The accounts differ, as they often do in the old stories. In one version, Hera threw him from Olympus at birth, disgusted by his lameness, and his fall lasted a full day before he landed in the sea, where the sea nymphs found him and raised him with a love that was kinder than anything his mother had offered. In another version, it was Zeus who threw him. He had tried to intervene in one of his parents' terrible arguments, tried to step between the thunder and the fury, and Zeus had grabbed him and flung him from the heights of heaven. He fell for a day, and when he landed on the island of Lemnos, his legs were broken, and they never healed properly. But from that pain came something extraordinary. Hephaestus, seated at his forge, with the fires of the volcano beneath him and the unlimited patience of a craftsman who has nowhere else to go and nothing else to be, became the greatest maker of things in the history of the universe. His workshop was beneath the earth, in the heart of the volcano, where the fire never went out and the bellows never stopped, and from that workshop came the golden armor of the gods, the nets that could not be untangled, the automata of bronze that walked and served and protected, the palaces of Olympus themselves. Hephaestus made the world beautiful in the specific way that only things made with extraordinary skill and deep personal investment can be beautiful. Every object he crafted carried within it a piece of his own long, patient, painful story. And then there was Hermes, quick, clever, laughing Hermes, who was born at dawn and by evening had stolen Apollo's cattle and was already denying it with an innocent expression and an elaborate story. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, the guide of souls to the underworld, the patron of travelers and thieves and merchants and anyone whose life depended on moving quickly and talking well. He wore winged sandals and carried the caduceus, his herald staff, wreathed in serpents, and he could move between the worlds in an instant, from Olympus to the deepest places of the underworld and back again, without the journey costing him anything at all. And Aphrodite, who had been born from the sea foam and the suffering of Uranus, who had arrived at Cyprus with her hair still wet from the ocean, and the world's beauty intensified around her as though her presence was itself a kind of light. Aphrodite took her place among the Olympians as the goddess of love and desire and the terrible, irresistible force that draws one being toward another. She was married to Hephaestus, which the other gods found both practical and slightly ridiculous, the most beautiful goddess in existence paired with the lame and smoke-stained craftsman. But beauty and craft have always had a relationship, and Aphrodite and Hephaestus made a kind of sense, in their own way, even if their marriage was far from peaceful. These were the 12 Olympians, 12 gods whose domains covered every aspect of the world and of human experience, whose personalities between them contained every quality that the Greeks recognized in themselves and in the universe they inhabited. They were not simple. They were not always good. They were powerful and petty and magnificent and jealous and generous and cruel and loving in the specific way that powerful beings who have never been made truly vulnerable are loving, which is to say, imperfectly, inconsistently, with a tendency to retreat from anything that costs too much. And now the world was arranged, and the gods were seated in their high places, and the question of what to do with the earth, with the middle world that lay between the heavens and the depths, was beginning to press itself forward. There had been humans of sorts in the ages before. The golden race had lived under Cronus's reign, gentle and uncorrupted, dying peacefully when their time came and becoming benevolent spirits who watched over the living. After them had come the silver race, who were less golden in every sense. They spent 100 years in childhood and only a brief, violent, impious adulthood, and they refused to honor the gods, and so Zeus had swept them away. The bronze race had been fierce and warlike, obsessed with the implements of battle, and they had destroyed themselves with their own violence. The race of heroes, the demigods, the great ones, the men and women whose deeds would fill the stories, had come and were coming still, the product of divine interference in human affairs, of gods who could not keep themselves from reaching down into the mortal world and touching it with their power. But before the heroes, before the great age of quests and monsters and divine punishments, there was the question of how humanity had come to exist at all. And for that, there was Prometheus. Prometheus, the Titan who had sided with Zeus, who had foreseen the outcome of the war and chosen accordingly, was not rewarded with great power or dominion. He was given a different kind of honor, the work of creation, the task of shaping the mortal world. He and his brother Epimetheus were tasked with populating the earth, with giving to each creature its nature and its gifts. Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought, the one who acts and thinks later, went to work immediately, distributing gifts to the animals with generous and indiscriminate enthusiasm. He gave the lion its strength and the deer its speed and the bird its wings and the turtle its shell and the fish its streamlined body designed for the water. He gave the bear its ferocity and the chameleon its ability to change and the bee its sting and the elephant its memory. He gave and gave, with a kind of uncritical delight in the variety of what he was producing, and by the time he was done, all the gifts had been distributed, and there was nothing left, and then Prometheus looked at the human being. A creature he had fashioned from clay and water, from the good dark earth of the world's body, shaped in the image of the gods themselves, upright and with hands capable of making things and with eyes that could look at the sky and wonder, and he saw that the human being had nothing. No fur to keep it warm. No claws or fangs for protection. No speed to outrun the predators. No natural weapon, no built-in armor, nothing that would allow this small and naked creature to survive even a single night in the world as it was. Prometheus looked at the human being and felt something. The old stories do not give a precise name to what he felt, but it reads, across all the centuries, unmistakably as love. A specific kind of love, the love of a maker for the thing he has made, complicated by the awareness that the made thing is fragile and the world is not, that the creation is precious and the indifferent universe is not interested in its preciousness. He looked at the humans, small and cold, crouching in the dark without fire, and he decided that something needed to be done. He went to Olympus. He went up to the great forge of Hephaestus, or perhaps up to the chariot of Helios, Where the fire of the sun itself burned, the stories differ on this detail, but agree on everything that matters. He took the fire. He carried it away from heaven, hidden in the hollow of a fennel stalk, that common plant that holds its dry interior for a long time without burning, and he brought it down to the humans. When the first fire sparked and caught and rose in the hands of a mortal, something fundamental changed. The night became less absolute. The cold became less complete. The animals that had seemed so threatening drew back from the light. And the humans, gathered around the first fire, looked at each other across the flames with the particular expression of beings who have just received something they did not know they were missing, something that answers a need so deep it felt, until this moment, simply like the basic texture of existence, the cold, the dark, the fear. With fire, everything became possible. With fire, metal could be worked, food could be cooked, clay could be hardened, poison could be driven from roots and leaves. With fire, humans could survive winter and move into the colder regions of the world and live through the long nights. With fire, they could gather together and tell stories, and stories meant that knowledge could be passed from one generation to the next. That the hard-won lessons of one life did not disappear when that life ended, but were carried forward and built upon and slowly accumulated into something that began to look, over many generations, like wisdom. Prometheus gave humanity fire, and in doing so, he gave them civilization itself. And Zeus, sitting on his throne above the clouds, looked down at what had happened, and his expression was not the expression of a god who has been surprised. He had known this was possible. He had known that Prometheus would be tempted to intervene, to give these fragile creatures something to tip the balance in their favor. And he had decided, in his own complex divine way, that the theft of fire could not go unanswered. Zeus looked at Prometheus with the full weight of his divine authority, and he made his decision, and he carried it out with the terrible efficiency that only absolute power can manage. He ordered Prometheus seized. He had him chained not with ordinary chains, but with unbreakable bonds, the specific restraints that only the divine forge could produce, and he had him dragged to the Caucasus Mountains, to a high rock in the east where the sun came up each morning and struck the stone before it struck anything else. There, Prometheus was chained to the rock. And each day, as the sun rose, an eagle came. An enormous eagle, with a wingspan that cast a shadow across the whole face of the mountain, and eyes that held no mercy and no personal feeling, only the cold mechanical purpose of a punishment ordained from above. Each day, the eagle landed on Prometheus's chest, and with its beak it opened his body, and it ate his liver. And each night, because Prometheus was divine and could not simply die, the liver regenerated, growing back complete and whole while the Titan lay on his rock and looked at the stars and breathed. And each morning, the eagle came again. This was the punishment. Not death, which would have been, in some terrible way, a mercy, but an endless cycle of suffering, precisely calibrated to the specific quality of divine existence, the regeneration that should have been a blessing turned into the mechanism of eternal torment. Prometheus lay on his rock and felt the eagle's talons and did not cry out, at least not in the way the stories tell it. He endured. He looked at the distant earth below him, where the humans moved around their fires, warming themselves in the dark, and he did not regret what he had done. This is one of the most important things the Greeks ever said about the nature of heroism. That a hero is not someone who does what is easy, or even what is sensible, but someone who does what he cannot choose not to do, and then endures the consequences with as much dignity as the consequences allow. There were those who came to Prometheus on his rock. Io, the unfortunate mortal woman who had been transformed into a white cow by Zeus to hide her from Hera's jealousy, wandered to the foot of his mountain during her long and wandering exile, and they spoke to each other. And he told her something of what lay ahead for her, offering the only gift he still had, which was foresight. Oceanus came, riding his sea creature, and offered to intercede with Zeus, an offer Prometheus dismissed with something close to contempt, because he knew that intercession was not what was needed, that the punishment would last precisely as long as Zeus decided it would last, and that no amount of negotiation would change that. The release, when it finally came through a hero. Heracles, the greatest hero the mortal world would ever produce, Zeus's own son by a mortal woman, a being of extraordinary strength and complicated destiny, came to the Caucasus during the course of his labors and shot the eagle from the sky and broke the chains. Prometheus was free. But the story of Heracles belongs to a later time, and the world was not done shaping the conditions under which he and all his kind would have to live. Because there was still the matter of Pandora. Zeus, still angry, and Zeus, it must be said, had a long memory and a deep treasury of ways to express divine displeasure, looked at the humans who had received Prometheus's gift and decided that the gift needed to be balanced by something else. Not a punishment, exactly. The Greeks were too sophisticated for simple punishments, but a complication. A reminder that gifts do not come without cost, that the world is not arranged for the convenience of any single species, and that the fire which warms also burns. He went to Hephaestus, and he gave him instructions, and Hephaestus, who did not ask too many questions when Zeus came with a commission, because questions asked in that context tended to produce answers that were worse than the original uncertainty. Went to his forge and made something entirely new. He made a woman. Not born from the earth or from the sea or from the body of another goddess. Made. Crafted from clay, shaped with the specific attention that only Hephaestus could give, a being designed from the very beginning to be beautiful in a way that was simultaneously genuine and deliberate. And then the gods of Olympus gathered around this new creation and each gave her a gift. Athena gave her skill in weaving and the arts of the household. Aphrodite gave her the quality of beauty that makes the heart ache when it sees her. The Graces gave her charm and the easy grace of movement. The Horai, the goddesses of the seasons, dressed her in flowers. Hermes gave her, last of all, the gift of a quick and flattering tongue, the ability to say what people wanted to hear, and beneath that, something else, a curiosity that would not rest, of a reaching quality that could not leave a closed thing closed. They named her Pandora, all gifted, the one to whom all things have been given. And they gave her, as a wedding gift, a large jar. Some later stories call it a box, and the word has stuck, but it was a jar, a great storage vessel of the kind the Greeks used to keep wine and oil and grain, sealed with a stopper that kept the contents safe and contained. The jar was given to her with a single instruction: do not open it. She was sent to Epimetheus, afterthought, the brother of Prometheus, the one who acted first and considered later. Prometheus had warned his brother not to accept gifts from Zeus, because he had foreseen exactly where this was going, but Prometheus was chained to his rock. And Epimetheus looked at Pandora and found that Hermes' gift of persuasion and Aphrodite's gift of beauty between them constituted an argument he could not effectively resist. He accepted her. They were married. The jar sat in the corner of their home. Pandora looked at it, and looked away, and looked at it again. The instruction not to open it made it more present, not less. Every closed door is, in some sense, an invitation. Every sealed container is a question that wants to be answered. She tried to ignore it. She was not weak, or stupid, or careless. She was made with a curiosity that was itself one of her gifts, that was part of the beauty of her design, and the gods who had built that curiosity into her had also built the jar, and the combination was not an accident. One day, she opened it. What came out was not dramatic in the way that explosions or thunderbolts are dramatic. It was quiet. It was a pouring out rather than a blasting apart. From the jar came all the things that make human life hard, illness in all its forms, from the smallest ache to the fever that burns the mind. Old age came out, with its particular exhaustion and loss. Grief came out. Strife came out. Hard work and toil. Envy and spite, and the specific misery of seeing someone else have what you want. They spread through the world like smoke, finding every corner of a room, and the world they spread through was the world of mortals, because it was the mortal world that had been chosen as the space where these forces would do their work. Pandora, horrified, slammed the lid back down. The stories say she was afraid, and perhaps she was. But there is another reading, and it is a reading the Greeks themselves suggested. She was also strong enough, in that moment, to stop. She stopped. The jar was not emptied completely. At the very bottom of it, under all the terrible things that had poured out into the world, one thing remained. It had not escaped. It was still there, still alive, still present. Hope. Elpis, in the Greek, not simply the wish for better things, but the specific quality of expectation, of leaning toward a future that is not yet here, of believing, even in the face of all evidence to the contrary, that things can change. Hope stayed in the jar, preserved under the closed lid, available to humans whenever they reached for it, whenever they needed to believe that the suffering that had been released was not the final word. There is so much to say about this. The Greeks understood something deeply true in the image of hope left at the bottom of the jar, and scholars and philosophers have argued for centuries about what exactly it means. Is hope a comfort, or is it a trap? Is it the one gift that makes all the suffering bearable, or is it the most cruel of all the things in the jar, because it keeps people enduring when they should accept? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps the Greek genius was in refusing to resolve the tension, in saying, hope is neither simply good nor simply bad, but it is the thing that remains, and the fact that it remains matters, and what you do with it is up to you. And so the world was made fully human. Not because humans were created to suffer, but because a universe that contains only ease and abundance and gift without cost is not, in the deepest sense, a real universe. The Greeks were too honest to pretend otherwise. They knew, from their own experience of being alive, that suffering was not an accident or an error, but was woven into the fabric of existence, and what they wanted was not to deny this, but to find within it some dignity, some meaning, some story worth telling. And so the stories began in earnest. The gods of Olympus did not stay in their high places and look down at the world from a careful and respectful distance. They were far too interested for that. They were curious and involved and sometimes genuinely invested in the fates of particular humans, and sometimes simply using the mortal world as an extension of their own complicated emotional lives, a stage on which they could play out their jealousies and competitions and desires without the constraints that applied among divine equals. Zeus, in particular, had a way of finding the mortal world deeply interesting. He moved through it in many forms, as a swan, as a bull, as a shower of gold, as a perfectly ordinary man, and he left behind him a trail of children who carried within them some portion of the divine fire, who were capable of things that ordinary mortals were not, who would be called to extraordinary tasks by the very nature of what they were. These were the heroes. These were the demigods, the ones who stood between the human and the divine, who suffered as humans suffered, but who also had access, sometimes, to a power or a purpose or a protection that ordinary humans did not. But before the heroes, the gods themselves had stories to tell, and those stories were not simple. They were tangled and complicated and sometimes beautiful and sometimes deeply unjust, and they were, in every case, illuminating, revealing something true about power and love and jealousy and the specific ways that even the greatest beings can be reduced by the smallness of their own fears. Demeter and Persephone. This is a story that the ancient Greeks knew in their bodies, because they were farmers, because their lives depended on the growing of things, because the mystery of why the earth goes cold in winter and comes back to life in spring was not a distant abstract question, but the most immediate and practical fact of their existence. And they answered it with a story that is also, in its deepest truth, a story about every mother and every child, about every separation and every return, about the way that love, even divine love, cannot protect its object from the world's necessity. Persephone was Demeter's daughter, the child of the harvest goddess and Zeus, and she was everything that spring is, young and luminous and full of growing things, moving through the world as though the world had been made specifically for the pleasure of her movement through it. She spent her days in the meadows and the flowering fields, gathering flowers with the daughters of the Oceanids, her companions, filling her arms with narcissus and crocus and the heavy-headed wildflowers that grew wherever the earth was undisturbed. On a particular day, a day like many other days, golden and warm, the meadow full of the specific late afternoon light that makes everything look more beautiful than it knows itself to be, Persephone reached for a narcissus that was more beautiful than any of the others, that seemed to glow with an inner light that had been placed there, if she had thought about it, too deliberately to be an accident. The earth opened beneath her. The darkness came up to meet her. And before she had time to cry out or to resist or to understand what was happening, she was gone, pulled down through the opening in the earth and into the kingdom beneath. Hades had been watching her. For how long, the stories do not say with certainty, but the impression they give is of a long and patient watching, a god who had spent eternity in the kingdom of the dead. In that silent and shadowless place where the shades of the departed walked without joy and without memory, and who had looked up at the world above and seen this bright particular girl moving through the flowers, and had felt, for the first time, something that broke through the cold. He had gone to Zeus. He had asked. Some versions say he had been encouraged, that Zeus, with his complicated divine calculations, had quietly given his blessing to a plan he pretended not to know about. Whatever the full truth of it, the earth opened, and Persephone disappeared into the dark, and the chariot of Hades carried her down into the kingdom that would become her home. Demeter did not know immediately. She searched. The search of a mother for a lost child. There is no more primal human experience than this, and the Greek poets understood it, and they gave it to a goddess, because some sorrows are too large to fit inside a mortal body. Demeter searched the whole earth. She went from one end to the other, carrying torches because the darkness did not matter to her, because the night did not stop her, because nothing was going to stop her from finding her daughter. She asked everyone she met, and most of them knew nothing, and the few who knew something were afraid to say it. It was Hecate, the goddess of the crossroads, who had heard the cry from her cave. It was Helios, the sun, who had seen everything from his high position in the sky, who finally told Demeter the truth. Her daughter was in the underworld, taken by Hades, and Zeus had known. The grief became rage, and the rage became something that acted on the world in immediate and devastating ways. Demeter withdrew. She stopped the work of the harvest. She turned from the earth and let it go cold under her absence, and the crops withered, and the fields that had been full of grain stood empty, and the fruit trees lost their fruit before it ripened, and the animals that depended on the growth of things began to suffer. And the humans who depended on the animals began to suffer, and the offerings to the gods grew thinner, and the prayers more desperate. Zeus watched the earth dying and understood that this could not go on. He sent Hermes down to the underworld, down through the layers of the world, down past the river Styx where Charon waited in his slow boat, past the guard dog Cerberus with his 3 heads, into the pale kingdom where the shades moved without sound or purpose. Hermes went to Hades and delivered Zeus's message. Persephone must be returned to her mother. Hades, in the underworld, had not been unkind to Persephone. The stories suggest that he loved her in his way, the cold, careful, genuine way of a being who has never known warmth and is trying to learn. He gave her a kingdom. He gave her a throne beside his. He gave her the title of Queen of the Dead, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, a position of enormous power, a sovereignty over every soul that had ever died or would ever die. But he had also known that she would want to leave, and he had prepared for this, and before Hermes arrived with Zeus's command, he offered Persephone something to eat. 6 pomegranate seeds. Whether she ate them knowing what they meant, or whether she ate them in a moment of hunger and sorrow without thinking clearly, or whether she ate them in some complicated act of choice that she could not fully articulate even to herself. This is the question the ancient Greeks could not agree on, and it is the question that has made this story endure, because it is a question about agency and desire and the way that people sometimes choose the thing that binds them without being able to explain why. The rule was absolute and ancient. Anyone who ate the food of the dead was bound to the underworld. By eating 6 seeds, Persephone had bound herself to the underworld for 6 months of every year. Hermes brought her back, up through the layers of the world, up into the air and the light, and Demeter, who was waiting, took her daughter in her arms with a joy so complete that the earth felt it immediately. The fields greened. The wheat pushed up through the cold soil. The fruit trees bloomed. The world came back to life in the way that it does each spring, suddenly, lavishly, as though it had been saving everything up. But Persephone would return to the underworld for 6 months of every year, when the earth would grow cold again, and the crops would die and the world would wait, with the patient trust of a thing that has learned through long experience that absence is not permanent. That return is built into the structure of things, that spring follows winter as surely as the daughter of Demeter returns to the surface of the earth when her time in the dark is done. This is the Greek explanation of the seasons, not a meteorological fact, but a story of love and loss, and the complicated negotiations of divine power, and it is a far more satisfying explanation, because it contains within it the full weight of what the seasons mean to people who live with them. Winter is not simply cold. It is the absence of Persephone, the withdrawal of Demeter's care, the world expressing its grief. And spring is not simply warm. It is a reunion, a restoration, a proof that even the most complete seeming losses are not final. In this period, in this age when the gods were still learning what it meant to govern the world and the mortals were still learning what it meant to inhabit it, divine interference in human affairs was constant and took a bewildering variety of forms. The gods fell in love with humans, or something that functioned like love, something that was at minimum an intense and consuming interest that demanded to be satisfied. They competed with humans in contests of skill and paid attention to the outcomes with a seriousness that sometimes suggested they were less confident in their own superiority than their divine status would imply. The story of Arachne is one of these. A mortal weaver of such extraordinary skill that she boasted she could surpass even Athena herself, the goddess of crafts and wisdom. Athena came to her in disguise as an old woman and offered gentle warning. Pride before the gods was dangerous, and it would be wise to moderate her claims. Arachne dismissed the warning with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about her own abilities before, and so Athena revealed herself, and the contest was arranged, and they wove against each other. Arachne's tapestry was extraordinary. She wove into it the loves and deceits and transformations of the gods, Zeus as a swan, Zeus as a bull, the long and compromised catalogue of divine behavior that the gods might have preferred not to see rendered in such exquisite and truthful detail. It was, by every measure, perfect. Athena looked at it and could find no flaw in the workmanship, and the subject matter was true, which was perhaps the most uncomfortable thing about it. Athena destroyed the tapestry. She struck Arachne on the head with her shuttle, and the shame and the despair of this drove Arachne to try to hang herself, and Athena, who was not entirely without mercy, intervened before the act was complete and transformed her instead. Arachne became the first spider, condemned to weave forever, but in a new form, hanging from her thread, her work as intricate and as perfectly geometric as ever. Her descendants spreading across the world to build their own tiny perfect structures for all time. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of so many Greek myths, that the divine punishment for excellence and for truth-telling is not always different from the punishment for arrogance and excess. Arachne was right. Her work was good. Her assessment of herself was accurate. But she had transgressed the invisible boundary between mortal capability and divine privilege, and the Greek world, which was deeply conscious of this boundary, which had built its entire religious practice around the maintenance of it, could not reward her for the transgression, however much it might have sympathized. The concept the Greeks had for this transgression was hubris, and it is important to understand that hubris did not simply mean pride in the modern sense. It meant the specific act of overreaching, of claiming or taking what belonged to a higher order, of forgetting the proper proportion between what one was and what one aspired to be. It was not simply a character flaw. It was an act, a doing, and its consequences followed with the kind of inevitability that the Greeks found, simultaneously, deeply satisfying and deeply terrifying. Because the gods were watching. The gods were always watching. And the Greek universe was, at its most fundamental level, a universe of consequence, a place where nothing went unnoticed and nothing went unpunished, and where the relationship between action and outcome was not random or capricious, but deeply, almost mathematically just. Or at least that was the theory. In practice, as the myths make uncomfortably clear, justice in the Greek universe was frequently indistinguishable from power, and the outcomes were often determined less by what was deserved than by whose patron happened to be stronger. Apollo and his loves are a study in this. Daphne, the nymph who ran from him, transformed into a laurel tree by her father, the river god Peneus, at the very moment Apollo caught up with her, her flesh becoming bark under his hands, her hair becoming leaves, her outstretched arms becoming branches. Apollo wept. He held the tree that had been Daphne and promised her that she would be his symbol forever, that the laurel would crown the heads of the victorious and the celebrated for all time. He made her grief into a kind of honor, which is a thing that is simultaneously beautiful and not quite enough. Cassandra, the Trojan princess, who accepted Apollo's gift of prophecy and then rejected his advances, and found herself cursed with a prophecy that no one would believe. She would see the future clearly and truly, would cry out her warnings with the force of perfect knowledge, and everyone who heard her would dismiss her as a madwoman, and the things she foresaw would happen anyway, and she would be present to see them, and unable to stop them, for the rest of her life. This was Apollo's revenge, not to take back the gift, but to make the gift unbearable, to transform the ability to see clearly into the specific torture of watching, helplessly, as the things you predicted come to pass. Hyacinthus, the beautiful young Spartan prince whom Apollo loved, genuinely, deeply, in the way that the sun loves the things it shines upon, with a warmth that is also a kind of possession, was killed by a discus that Apollo himself had thrown. Zephyrus, the west wind, who also loved Hyacinthus and was consumed by jealousy, blew the discus off course, and it struck the youth in the head, and he died while Apollo held him, and from his blood there grew a flower, the hyacinth, and on its petals. The old stories say, Apollo wrote his grief in letters that only those who looked closely enough could read. Niobe, who had 14 children and boasted that she was therefore superior to Leto, who had only 2. Leto's 2 were Apollo and Artemis, and between them, in a single terrible afternoon, they killed all 14 of Niobe's children, the sons falling to Apollo's arrows, the daughters to Artemis's. Niobe was turned to stone by her own grief, the stone still weeping, water running from it in what the Greeks saw as the tears that could not stop even after feeling had ceased. These stories are not comfortable. They are not meant to be. They are about what happens when mortals forget the boundary, or when the gods move with excessive force, or both at once, and the result is always the same. The mortal world bears the cost, and the divine world continues. And the only question that remains is whether anything of meaning was produced in the encounter, and sometimes it was. Sometimes the contact between the divine and the mortal produced something that transcended both, a new form, a new understanding, a new story that would carry within itself, for centuries, a truth that could not have been arrived at any other way. The Greeks understood this. They did not simply resent the gods for their cruelty. They also loved them for what the cruelty produced, for the strange beauty that sometimes emerged from the terrible collisions of divine power and human limitation. Which brings us, at last, to the heroes. The Great Age of Heroes. The time when the world was filled with extraordinary human beings, partly divine, partly mortal, entirely the product of a universe in which the boundary between heaven and earth was still permeable, still crossed in both directions, still producing offspring that partook of both. Perseus was among the first of the great heroes, and his story is in some ways the cleanest and most archetypal. The young man with nothing but a divine father's favor, a clear impossible task, and the intelligence and courage to find a way through. His mother was Danae, the daughter of King Acrisius of Argos, and Acrisius had received a prophecy that his daughter's son would one day kill him. He responded to this information by doing what powerful men throughout history have done when they receive news they do not like. He tried to prevent it from happening through containment. He imprisoned Danae in a bronze tower, sealed from the world, admitting no visitors, allowing no possibility of the daughters bearing a child. Zeus came to her as a shower of golden light, a rain of gold that fell through the ceiling of the bronze tower and filled the room with warmth and the specific quality of divine attention. And 9 months later, Danae held in her arms a son she named Perseus, and Acrisius, discovering the baby, went white with the knowledge that the prophecy was already in motion, already undeniable. He could not bring himself to kill his daughter and grandson directly. The gods would punish him for that, and he was already playing a dangerous game with fate. Instead, he put them in a wooden chest and sealed it and threw it into the sea. The chest floated. The gods, or the sea, or the specific quality of a destiny that had already been set in motion, carried it gently to the island of Seriphos, where it was found by a fisherman named Dictys, who pulled it from the water and opened it and found inside a young woman and a baby who looked at him with eyes that were not entirely ordinary. Dictys took them to his brother, King Polydectes, who welcomed them with a hospitality that did not remain simple for long. Perseus grew on Seriphos. He grew into himself, strong and quick and thoughtful, with the particular quality of attention that marks the person who has been formed by difficulty rather than by ease. And Polydectes, as Perseus grew more interested in Danae and found the presence of the growing young man increasingly inconvenient, and decided that the most efficient solution to both problems was to send Perseus somewhere he was unlikely to come back from. He announced that he was going to court the princess Hippodamia and that he was collecting gifts from all the young men of the island, horses, as was traditional. Perseus had no horse. Perseus had nothing. And so Perseus, with the pride and the foolishness of youth, announced that he would bring whatever gift was asked of him. And Polydectes asked for the head of Medusa. Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgons, monstrous sisters who lived at the edge of the world, at the place where the sea met the nothing beyond. The Gorgons had hair of living snakes and claws of bronze and eyes that could turn any living thing to stone. To look directly at them was to die. To go where they lived was to enter a place from which no one had returned. Polydectes was essentially sending Perseus to his death, and both of them knew it. But Perseus had help. The gods are complicated, but they are not entirely absent from the lives of those they have chosen, and Perseus had been chosen, and so the help came. Athena came first, with her shield of polished bronze, a mirror, effectively, something that could reflect the world without allowing the viewer to look at it directly. Then Hermes came, with a pair of winged sandals and a special blade, a sickle of adamant that could cut through anything. And from Athena, or from Hermes, or from the nymphs at the edge of the world, the stories arranged this differently. There came also the Cabesus, a magical bag in which the Gorgon's severed head could be safely stored without the risk of its deadly gaze. Perseus needed to find the Gorgons, and for this he needed help from the 3 ancient sisters who shared between them a single eye and a single tooth, passing them back and forth, ancient beyond reckoning, sitting at the edge of the world in their blind and toothless state between each exchange. Perseus intercepted the eye in the moment of passing, when it was in none of their hands, and held it ransom until they told him what he needed to know. He found the Gorgons at the edge of the world, and he approached them flying backward on his winged sandals, watching their reflection in the polished bronze of the shield, and he found Medusa sleeping, the only mortal of the 3, the only one whose death was possible. And he swung the sickle with the specific careful courage of a man who is terrified but doing it anyway, and Medusa's head fell, and Perseus caught it without looking at it and thrust it into the bag and flew away as the immortal Gorgon sisters woke and screamed and searched for the killer of their sister. From Medusa's severed neck came things that only the ancient imagination could have produced. The winged horse Pegasus sprang from the blood, the great white horse with wide wings that would carry Bellerophon and defeat the Chimera and eventually become a constellation, and Chrysaor, the being with the golden sword, who would go on to father his own monsters. The violence of the origin did not diminish the beauty of what emerged from it. This is something the Greeks returned to again and again, that beauty and power and grace could arise from terrible acts, that the world's most extraordinary things were often born in pain. Perseus, flying home, passed over Ethiopia, and there he saw something that stopped him even in the midst of his urgent return. Chained to a rock on the coast, with the sea moving restlessly below her and the sky offering no help, was a young woman of extraordinary beauty, the kind of beauty that was unmistakable even in her distress, even in the specific despairing stillness of someone who has stopped struggling because struggling no longer seems to make any difference. Her name was Andromeda, and her situation was the direct result of her mother Cassiopeia's boasting that Andromeda was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs, and the sea nymphs had gone to Poseidon with this insult. And Poseidon had sent a sea monster to terrorize the Ethiopian coast, and the oracle had told Andromeda's father Cepheus that the only remedy was to chain his daughter to the coast and offer her to the monster as a sacrifice. Perseus landed beside her. He saw the monster coming, Cetus, enormous and ancient and terrible, pushing through the water with the absolute indifference of a creature that has no reason to feel threatened by anything on the shore. Perseus went up to Andromeda's father and made his bargain. He would kill the monster in exchange for Andromeda's hand in marriage. Cepheus agreed immediately, with the relief of a father who would have agreed to almost anything in that moment. Perseus put on his winged sandals and went up into the sky and came down on the sea monster from above, and the fight was not elegant. It was frantic and wet and brutal, the monster thrashing the sea into white foam. Perseus stabbing and dodging and stabbing again. He killed it. He killed it, and then stood on the corpse in the shallow water and looked at Andromeda and knew, in the way that people sometimes know things before they have thought them through, that this was the person he was going to spend his life with. He returned to Seriphos with Andromeda and with Medusa's head still safely in the bag, and he found his mother still there, still under the unwanted attentions of Polydectes, and he found Polydectes himself in the middle of a feast, holding court, still arrogantly certain that his inconvenient problem had taken care of itself somewhere at the edge of the world. Perseus walked into the feast and told Polydectes he had returned with the promised gift, and when Polydectes and his court laughed, Perseus opened the bag. The stone statues of Polydectes and all his court are still there, the stories say, on the island of Seriphos, frozen in their last expressions, some laughing, some surprised, some in the act of reaching for wine cups that they would never lift again. And Acrisius, the grandfather who had set the whole story in motion with his fear of the prophecy, Perseus found him eventually, not through pursuit or intention, but through the specific cruelty of fate, which does not require malice to accomplish its purposes. At the funeral games at Larissa, Perseus threw a discus that was caught by the wind and carried off its intended course, and it struck an old man in the crowd, and the old man was Acrisius, and he died. The prophecy was fulfilled not by hatred or by revenge, but by accident, by a moment of inattention, by the discus thrown in a direction that had nothing to do with the king who had once locked his daughter in a tower and thrown his daughter and grandson into the sea. This is the hardest thing the Greeks said about fate, that it does not require cooperation, that it works through ordinary events, through weather and crowds and athletic competitions, that no amount of foresight or precaution or elaborate planning makes a difference, because the prophecy knows ways around every obstacle, and the thing that kills you is usually the thing you never thought to guard against. But fate is not the only story. Alongside it, running through every Greek myth, is the other force, choice. The capacity of the individual, divine or mortal, to decide how to respond to what cannot be changed, to determine what kind of person to be in the face of the inevitable. Perseus chose to help Andromeda. He could have flown past her on his way home. Fate would not have stopped him. He made a choice, and that choice made his life the shape it was, and the lives of everyone connected to him a different shape than they would otherwise have been. This dual understanding that fate shapes the outline of a life, but that choice fills in the content, is at the very center of the Greek vision of existence, and it is why the heroes matter so much, even though they always, in some sense, fail. They fail to escape their fates. But they succeed in choosing themselves, and the choice, the choosing, is what the stories preserve. Theseus was born of two fathers, or one, depending on how you count. His mother Aethra lay with both King Aegeus of Athens and Poseidon on the same night, and the son she bore the following spring had the qualities of both, the kingship and the mortal responsibility of Aegeus, and the sea strength and the divine protection of the god of the waters. Theseus grew in treason with his mother, not knowing who his father was, and when he was strong enough, the test being the ability to lift a great rock under which Aegeus had placed a sword and sandals. He lifted the rock and took the sword and the sandals and walked north to Athens to claim his heritage. The road to Athens was not safe. It was populated by brigands and monsters of a very specific kind, human beings who had turned their capacity for violence into something systematic and creative. Sauron, who kicked travelers off a cliff into the sea where a great turtle waited below. Procrustes, who had a bed that he claimed fit everyone, cutting off the legs of guests who were too tall and stretching those who were too short. These were the monsters of civilization's edges, not dragons or giants, but human cruelty given form and method. Theseus defeated each of them using their own methods, which the Greeks appreciated, not as irony exactly, but as a kind of poetic efficiency. He arrived in Athens and found his father engaged with the sorceress Medea, who had once helped Jason and now made her home at the Athenian court, and who recognized Theseus for what he was before Aegeus did, and tried to have him poisoned. Aegeus recognized the sword at the last moment, at the very moment the cup was being raised, and struck it away, and embraced his son, and banished Medea. But Athens had a problem. The city was under a tribute to Crete, a tribute that Athenians paid with their children, 7 young men and 7 young women sent to Crete every 9 years to be fed to the Minotaur, the monster at the center of the labyrinth. The Minotaur was the offspring of a terrible act. Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos, had been made to desire a white bull by Poseidon's punishment of Minos for failing to sacrifice the bull as promised, and from that unnatural union had come the Minotaur. The body of a man and the head of a bull, enormous and violent, living in the impossible maze that the master architect Daedalus had built for it, in the dark at the center of Crete. Theseus insisted on going with the tribute ship. Aegeus gave him black sails and told him, "If you succeed, change the sails to white on your return, so I will know from a distance whether you live." On Crete, Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, looked at Theseus with an expression that Aphrodite, somewhere, registered with satisfaction. Ariadne was clever and resourceful and deeply human in her capacity for love, and she went to Daedalus, who had built the labyrinth and knew its secret, and she got from him a ball of thread, and she went to Theseus and made him a simple offer: take the thread, tie one end to the entrance, unspool it as you go in, follow it out when you are done, and come back for me, because I cannot live in Crete after this. Theseus agreed. He went into the labyrinth. The stories are spare here, and perhaps deliberately so. They do not describe the interior of the labyrinth in detail, do not tell us what Theseus felt in the absolute dark, turning corners that led to more corners, hearing ahead of him the sound of the Minotaur moving in its prison. What they tell us is the result. He found the Minotaur, and he killed it, and he followed the thread back to the entrance. He sailed from Crete with Ariadne and the young Athenians he had saved, and he stopped at the island of Naxos, and in the night, while Ariadne slept on the beach, he sailed away without her. The reasons the old stories give are various and unsatisfying: divine command, or carelessness, or a betrayal that he did not think of as a betrayal, but the outcome was clear. Ariadne woke alone on Naxos, with the sound of the sea and the knowledge that she had been abandoned. She wept, and the god Dionysus found her there, and he loved her, and she became divine, which is not the same as being consoled. Theseus, sailing toward Athens, forgot to change the sails. He forgot, or he didn't think clearly, or the grief of leaving Ariadne, if he felt grief, had disordered him. Black sails on the horizon, and Aegeus, watching from the cliff at Saunion, saw the black and concluded what black sails meant, and jumped. He fell into the sea that bears his name still, the Aegean, and Theseus arrived home to find the city in mourning, and himself, unwillingly, a king. These moments of forgetting, of human failure at the critical instant, they run through the Greek stories like a dark thread. The hero who does everything right and then fails at the last step. Orpheus looking back. Theseus forgetting the sails. They are not presented as simple failures of character, as though the lesson is simply be more careful. They are presented as part of the structure of things, as the human dimension that fate always finds, the crack through which loss enters, no matter how strong or how brave or how divinely favored the person who faces it. These are hard lessons. They are the Greek way of preparing people for the fact that sometimes you do everything right and still lose the most important thing. And they are presented not with bitterness, exactly, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that this is true, and that it has always been true, and that the world continues anyway, that the stories continue. That meaning can be found even in the losses that have no explanation. Now let us speak of Heracles. Heracles. Hercules in the Roman telling, but Heracles in the Greek, which means glory of Hera, and the bitter irony of that name is woven through his entire story, because Hera was his enemy from the moment of his conception, the goddess of marriage. The queen of heaven, who looked at yet another mortal woman carrying Zeus's child, and felt the full force of a divine jealousy that had been accumulating for centuries. His mother was Alcmene, and Zeus came to her disguised as her husband Amphitryon on the night before the real Amphitryon returned from war, and he stayed 3 nights while the sun stood still in the sky. 3 nights made long because the universe itself was taking its time with this particular act of creation, because what was being made was more significant than the usual divine mortal encounter. What was being made was the greatest hero the world would ever see. Hera moved against him from the very beginning. She delayed his birth, arranging through divine manipulation for a lesser man to be born first, so that the prophecy Zeus had spoken, that a great king would be born on that day, applied to someone else. She sent 2 serpents into the cradle when Heracles was still an infant, and the infant Heracles woke and looked at the serpents and picked them up in his baby hands and strangled them, and the servants found him in the morning, sitting up in the cradle with a dead serpent in each hand, looking mildly interested. He grew up knowing what he was, which is a complicated kind of knowledge. To know yourself divine and mortal at once, to feel the strength in your hands that no ordinary person has, and to know also that you will die, that the divine portion of you will not save you from the mortality that is the other half of your inheritance. This is the burden the Greek heroes carried, and none of them carried it more fully or more painfully than Heracles. He was educated by the greatest teachers available, Chiron the centaur for some skills, and others for others, and he was precocious in everything, gifted beyond what even divine heritage would normally explain, as though the universe had concentrated into him everything it had been saving up. He killed his music teacher by accident as a young man, struck him with a lyre in a moment of frustration with strength he had not yet learned to modulate. He learned from that. He learned to be careful with himself, to hold back, to measure his force against the softness of the world around him. And then Hera struck. She sent madness upon him, a divine madness, a darkness that fell over his mind like a curtain, eliminating him from himself, leaving in his body something that only looked like Heracles. In that madness, he killed his wife Megara and his children. When the madness cleared and he stood in the ruin of what he had done, the grief was total and the self-disgust absolute. He went to the oracle at Delphi, to Apollo's sacred place at the navel of the world, and asked what he could do to atone. The oracle sent him to King Eurystheus of Tiryns, and Eurystheus sent him on his labors. 12 labors, each one designed to be impossible, each one a direct challenge to the limits of what was possible in the world. Eurystheus was a cowardly man who feared Heracles deeply, and there is something deeply human about the way he used the institutional power he had over Heracles. Zeus's prophecy had given Eurystheus this power, and he used it vindicatively. Finding tasks that were not just dangerous, but designed to be humiliating, tasks that tested not just strength, but endurance and cleverness, and the capacity to continue when everything inside you wants to stop. The first labor was the Nemean lion, a great beast with a hide that could not be penetrated by any weapon, living in the hills around Nemea and terrorizing everything within its reach. Heracles' arrows bounced off it. His sword bent against it. Eventually, he cornered it in its cave and strangled it with his bare hands, and then spent a day trying to skin it until Athena or Hermes, the stories offer both, suggested using the lion's own claws to cut its impenetrable hide. He wore the skin for the rest of his life, the lion's head as a hood, the claws hanging at his sides. A man armored in the hide of the thing he had killed. The Lernaean Hydra was the second labor, a water serpent with 9 heads, or perhaps 7, or perhaps more, living in the swamps of Lerna, poisonous beyond all measure, with the specific ability that its heads multiplied when cut. Cut 1. 2 grew back. Heracles went with his nephew Iolaus, and they fought the Hydra in the steam and the swamp, and every time Heracles cut a head, two replaced it, until Iolaus understood what was needed and began cauterizing the stumps with fire the moment each head fell, preventing the regrowth. Heracles dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, and those arrows became the most lethal weapons in the mortal world. A wound from one was inevitably fatal, no matter how small. The third labor was the Cernician hind, a golden-horned deer sacred to Artemis, which Heracles was required to capture alive and bring back to Eurystheus without harming it. He chased it for a year, across half the world, into the land of the Hyperboreans at the back of the north wind and back again, patient and relentless, until he caught it with a net, and Artemis confronted him, and he explained the circumstances. And Artemis, who understood necessity even when she didn't like it, let him take the hind. The Erymanthian boar, next, another capture rather than a kill, the great boar of the mountains driven into deep snow until it exhausted itself. The Augean stables, a humiliation dressed as labor, the vast stables of King Augeas that had not been cleaned in 30 years, holding the waste of enormous divine cattle herds. Eurystheus chose this specifically because it was disgusting, because it required not strength but wit and the willingness to do the undignified thing. Heracles diverted 2 rivers through the stables and cleaned them in a day. The Stymphalian birds, the man-eating birds with bronze feathers that shot their feathers like arrows, which Heracles drove from their lake with a rattle given him by Athena, and then shot down in their confusion. The Cretan bull, which Poseidon had once sent to Minos, and which Minos had kept rather than sacrificed, and which had run mad and was terrorizing Crete, Heracles captured it and brought it back, and then released it in the Peloponnese, where it continued to cause trouble until Theseus killed it. The maras of Diomedes, 4 horses fed on human flesh by the Thracian king Diomedes, which Heracles captured and then fed their owner to, which calmed them considerably. The girdle of Hippolyta, the belt of the Amazon queen, which Hera interfered with by spreading a rumor that caused a battle, and Hippolyta was killed in the confusion, and the girdle was taken. The cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant living on the island of Erythea at the far western edge of the world, whose red cattle Heracles drove back across 2 continents, killing Geryon and Geryon's dog and Geryon's herdsmen along the way. And at the edge of the world where Europe and Africa met, erecting the pillars of Heracles that marked the end of the navigable world. The 11th labor was the apples of the Hesperides, the golden apples that grew in the garden at the world's end, guarded by the dragon Ladon and by the Hesperides, the daughters of evening. To find where the garden was, Heracles first needed to consult Nereus, the shape-shifting old man of the sea, who he held down through all his transformations until the god gave him directions. He found Atlas on his mountain, bearing the sky on his shoulders, and he made his offer. I will hold the sky for you if you will get the apples from your daughter's garden. Atlas went, and came back with the apples, and suggested that perhaps he had grown comfortable without the sky's weight and might continue without it. Heracles said, "Yes, of course, but could you take it back for just a moment while I adjust the padding on my shoulders?" And Atlas took the sky back, and Heracles picked up the apples and walked away, which is why one of the most celebrated figures in Greek mythology is also one of its most celebrated con artists. The 12th labor was the one that required him to cross the final boundary, the boundary between the living world and the dead. He was sent to Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld, and he was told to bring it back alive, without using weapons. He went down through the entrance at Cape Maudapan, and he went past Charon and past the shades of the dead who reached toward him, and he went through the underworld to the throne room where Hades and Persephone sat in their cold majesty. And he asked permission to take the dog. Hades, who was known for his fairness even if not for his warmth, gave permission on the condition that Heracles used no weapons. Heracles found Cerberus at the gate and wrestled it with his bare hands, his lion skin protecting him from the dog's biting, and he held it until it submitted, and he dragged it up through the earth and back into the sunlight, where Eurystheus, who had been more and more frightened by the successful completion of each impossible task, looked at Cerberus and ran screaming and hid in a large storage jar. Heracles took Cerberus back to the underworld and completed his labors. But his story did not end there. It never does, with heroes. The 12 labors were the formal structure of his life, the great accomplishment that he is remembered by, but his life continued beyond them, full of further adventures and further suffering. He fell in love again, married Deianira, had children, tried to build a life that was worthy of the ordinary human joys he had spent so long deferred from. He made friends, Iphitus, whom he killed in another fit of madness and for whose death he was again enslaved. He sailed with the Argonauts briefly before his own story pulled him off course. He freed Prometheus on his journey through the Caucasus. And in the end, it was the dying centaur's blood that killed him. Nessus, who had been shot by one of Heracles' hydra-poisoned arrows for attempting to abduct Deianira, told her with his dying breath that his blood preserved in a garment would ensure Heracles' love forever, and she believed him, because she was frightened of losing her husband to a new passion. She soaked a robe in the blood and gave it to Heracles when he was preparing for a triumphant feast. The poison worked immediately and terribly. The robe burned into his flesh with a pain that nothing could stop, that divine strength made worse rather than better, because he could not die and so had to keep feeling it endlessly, with no prospect of relief. He tore at the robe and the flesh came with it. He threw himself into a river and the water began to boil. He lay on the mountain and he burned. He ordered a funeral pyre built on Mount Ida, and he climbed onto it himself, and no one who loved him could bring themselves to light it until a passing shepherd named Philoctetes agreed, and was given Heracles' bow and arrows as his reward. The pyre burned. The mortal part of Heracles burned with it. And what was left, what the fire purified and released, was the immortal portion, the divine inheritance from Zeus, and it rose from the pyre and was received on Olympus, where Hera, who had fought him his entire life, finally made her peace. And Heracles became a god, and the wheel of his long suffering finally stopped. The story of Heracles is the most fully human of all the great myths, because it is the story of a being who had every advantage, divine parentage, extraordinary strength, the protection of Athena, the support of most of Olympus, and who still suffered, constantly and catastrophically, largely at the hands of forces he could not control. It is not a story that teaches the easy lesson. It does not say, "Be strong and you will be happy." It says, "Be the strongest being who has ever lived and still you will suffer, and the suffering will not always make sense, and the best you can do is endure it with as much dignity as you can manage, and help people when you can, and be the person you are, fully and without apology for as long as you have." That is the heroic ideal. It is more honest than most ideals. It asks a lot, but it promises nothing except the meaning that comes from meeting the task, whatever the task turns out to be. Now we come to Jason, and to the voyage of the Argo, and to Medea, who is perhaps the most complex and most disturbing figure in all of Greek mythology. A woman of extraordinary power who was destroyed by the world's refusal to give her the one ordinary thing she asked for. Jason was the rightful heir to the throne of Iolcos, whose father had been deposed by the usurper Peleus. He arrived at court as a young man, missing one sandal. He had lost it helping an old woman across a river who was Hera in disguise, and Hera would protect him through much of what followed. And Peleus recognized the description from a prophecy that warned him to beware a man with one sandal. Peleus sent Jason to fetch the golden fleece from Colchis, at the far eastern edge of the world, beyond the clashing rocks and the kingdoms of the Black Sea, guarded by a dragon that never slept. It was meant to be an impossible task. Instead, it became the occasion for the greatest expedition the heroic age produced. The Argo was built with divine assistance. Athena placed in its prow a piece of timber from the sacred oak at Dodona, which could speak and prophesy. And the crew that assembled to sail it was extraordinary. Heracles was there at first, before his own story reclaimed him. Orpheus was there, the greatest musician the world had ever known, who could make rivers stop running with his singing and trees uproot themselves and follow him. Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, were there. Atalanta, the huntress, who was as fast as any man and had killed the Caledonian boar, was invited, and her invitation became the subject of debate that the stories record without quite resolving. There was Peleus, father of Achilles, already carrying within him the seed of the greatest story of all. They sailed through the Hellespont and the Propontis, navigating between the clashing rocks, the Symplegades, which crashed together to destroy any ship that tried to pass, by releasing a dove and watching it fly through. Then rowing with everything they had as the rocks crashed behind them, taking only the very tip of the Argo's stern. They encountered the Harpies, the wind spirits, who had been tormenting the blind prophet Phineas by snatching his food. In exchange for driving the Harpies away, Phineas told them what lay ahead. They survived the bronze giant Talos on Crete, who threw boulders at their ship. They faced storms and wonders and the specific challenge of maintaining a crew of exceptional people, each of whom had their own great destiny and their own great ego, on a single ship for a very long time. At Colchis, King Aetes had no intention of giving up the fleece, and he assigned Jason tasks designed to kill him: plow a field with fire-breathing bulls, sow it with dragon's teeth, destroy the warriors that would spring from the teeth. Jason stood in the palace of Aetes and looked at the impossible tasks, and Medea looked at Jason. Medea was a priestess of Hecate, a woman of deep magical knowledge and power, the granddaughter of Helios the sun, and she had never been interested in any man who had come to her father's court before. She was too capable, too knowing, too aware of the limitations of men who were impressive in their ambitions, but rarely impressive in their understanding. But something about Jason, perhaps his genuine helplessness in the face of her father's tasks, perhaps the specific quality of a person who has come a very long way on the basis of hope alone, moved something in her that had not been moved before. She helped him. She gave him ointments that made him invulnerable to the bull's fire for the day, and she told him the secret of the dragon's teeth warriors, which was to throw a stone in their midst so that they would attack each other rather than him. She helped him in every particular, risking everything she had: her home, her family, her standing, the world she had always known, because she had made the choice to help, and she was not a woman who made decisions halfway. Jason got the fleece. Medea put the dragon to sleep with her magic. They fled in the night, and Medea's brother Absyrtus was killed in the escape. The accounts differ on whether Medea killed him directly or whether Jason did, or whether it was more complicated than either. And his body was scattered so that their father would have to stop and collect the pieces, slowing the pursuit. They sailed home together, Medea and Jason, and they were married, and they arrived in Iolcos to find that Peleus had not kept his promise. Medea arranged Peleus's death with terrible cleverness, persuading his daughters that she could restore youth with a magic ritual, demonstrating it on an old ram that emerged young from her cauldron, and then substituting an inert mixture for the actual spell, so that when the daughters cut their father apart and put him in the cauldron, he did not emerge reborn. They fled again, to Corinth this time, and for some years they lived there, and Medea bore Jason children, and Jason was celebrated as the man who had brought the golden fleece to Greece, and Medea was not celebrated for having made this possible, which was the first sign of how the story was going to end. The king of Corinth offered Jason his daughter Glauce in marriage, a political alliance, a step up into the royal family, the kind of opportunity that practical men in the ancient world did not refuse. Jason decided to accept. He told Medea that she would remain in the household, that the new wife would not displace her entirely, that this was a practical arrangement, that she should understand. Medea understood perfectly. The rage that followed was not irrational. It was not the rage of a woman who couldn't control herself. It was the rage of a woman who had given up everything for a man who was now trading her for a step up the social ladder, and who knew, because she was too intelligent not to know, that in the world she now inhabited, she had no recourse. She had no father to return to. She had no kingdom. She had burned every bridge she had ever crossed, on the assumption that Jason was worth it. She sent wedding gifts to Glauce, a beautiful robe and a golden diadem, soaked in poison. Glauce put them on and died in agony, and her father Creon, rushing to her aid, died in the same agony when he touched her. And then Medea killed her children. She killed them herself, the children she loved, the children whose faces she studied as she made her decision, because she could see already what their lives would be without her protection, without a mother, without a home, subject to the hatred of Jason's new family. And she decided that her love for them was stronger than her desire to see them live. This is the most terrible thing in Greek mythology. More terrible than the worst monsters, more terrible than the cruelest divine punishments, because it is the act of a human being at the end of her options, making the only choice that she could bring herself to make. The Greeks did not present it simply. They did not say she was wrong. They did not say she was right. They presented it with the full force of its horror and the full weight of its logic, and they left the audience to sit with the unbearable complexity of it. Medea escaped in a chariot drawn by winged dragons, sent by her grandfather Helios, and Jason was left with nothing. No wife, no children, no allies, no future. He died later, the stories say, alone by the beached hull of the Argo, when a piece of the rotting ship fell and struck him on the head. The king who had sailed to the end of the world and back died under the wreckage of the ship that had made him famous. And now, the greatest story of all. The one that the Greeks themselves considered the central event of their mythological history, the story to which all the other stories led and from which all the other stories flowed. The story that was preserved in two of the most magnificent poems ever composed in any language, that was sung by blind poets in the courts of kings, that was copied and studied and argued over and performed for 2,000 years. That still reverberates in everything we write and everything we think about war and heroism and loss. The Trojan War. It began, as so many of the greatest disasters do, at a celebration. The wedding of the sea nymph Thetis and the mortal hero Peleus, a wedding attended by all the gods, or nearly all of them, because divine weddings were occasions of enormous celebration and the Olympians were not the kind of beings who willingly missed a party. Eris was not invited. Eris, the goddess of strife and discord, the sister of Ares, the being whose nature was friction and conflict and the particular pleasure of watching ordered things become disordered, she was considered too disruptive, too likely to cause trouble. And so the wedding invitation did not find her. She came anyway. She arrived at the feast and threw into the middle of it a golden apple with 3 words written on it, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses reached for it simultaneously, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And then they looked at each other, and the apple sat between them and Zeus, who was being asked to judge. Looked at the apple and at the 3 great goddesses of Olympus and at the expressions on their faces and wisely concluded that this was a judgment he was not equipped to make. He sent them to a mortal. Paris was the son of King Priam of Troy, or rather, he had been born as the son of Priam, but a prophecy at his birth had said he would bring ruin to Troy, and his mother Hecuba had been so frightened by this that the infant had been exposed on Mount Ida, left to die. He had not died. A she-bear nursed him, and eventually shepherds found him and raised him on the mountain, and he grew into a young man of extraordinary beauty, tending his flocks on Ida without knowing that he was the prince of the greatest city in the world. The 3 goddesses came to him on the mountain, escorted by Hermes, and each offered him a bribe. Hera offered power, kingship over many lands, the ability to rule and be obeyed. Athena offered wisdom and prowess in war, the ability to be always right and always victorious. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris chose Aphrodite. This choice, the choice of love over power and wisdom, is presented by the Greeks as simultaneously understandable and catastrophic. Understandable because of course a young man on a mountain with no particular ambitions would choose the beautiful woman. Catastrophic because the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, and Helen was already married to the king of Sparta. Her name was Helen, and she was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, another divine mortal union, this time in the form of a swan, and from her childhood the most beautiful human being who had ever existed. All the kings of Greece had tried to win her, and her stepfather Tyndareus, faced with the problem of choosing one suitor without making enemies of all the others, had accepted the advice of clever Odysseus, who asked for nothing but the hand of Penelope in return, and made all the suitors swear an oath to accept the outcome of the choosing, and to defend the chosen husband against anyone who wronged him. This was the oath of Tyndareus. It was the knot that tied all the heroes of Greece to the fate of a single marriage. When Paris came to Sparta, welcomed as a guest, wined and feasted and treated with the full hospitality that the guest-friend tradition demanded, and then sailed away with Helen while Menelaus was attending a funeral in Crete, the oath activated. Every man who had sworn it was bound to come to Menelaus's aid. Or perhaps Helen went willingly. Perhaps she was tired of Menelaus, tired of Sparta with its cold air and its martial culture, tired of being the most beautiful woman in the world in a place that valued strength over beauty and war over love. Perhaps Paris was young and radiant and said things that Menelaus had stopped saying years ago, and perhaps Aphrodite's hand was in all of it, and perhaps it does not matter, in the end, whether she went willingly or was taken against her will, because the oath was sworn and the ships were coming regardless. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, king of Mycenae, and Agamemnon called in every debt and every obligation, and the great fleet assembled at Aulis, 1,000 ships. The 1,000 ships of the most famous line in English translation of Greek poetry, carrying the greatest warriors Greece had ever produced, all of them bound for Troy. Achilles was among them. He was there because his mother Thetis, the sea nymph, who had always known what was coming, who had been told, when the gods had considered her for themselves and had finally given her in marriage to a mortal to prevent a prophecy, that her son would be the greatest warrior who had ever lived, and that he would die young, and that these two facts were inseparable. She had hidden him on the island of Scyros, dressed as a girl, hidden among the daughters of King Lycomedes, hoping to keep him from the war. He had been found by Odysseus, who came to Scyros with a chest of gifts, women's things, jewelry and cloth, but also, almost as an afterthought, a sword and a shield. And when a trumpet sounded and the other girls scattered in fear, Achilles grabbed the weapons and was found out and came to Troy. He came knowing he would die there, knowing his fame and his death were parts of the same story, choosing to come because the alternative, a long and ordinary life, forgotten before it was over, was worse to him than the young death with the eternal name. Odysseus was there, king of the small island of Ithaca, not the greatest warrior, not the strongest, not the most powerful, but the cleverest, the man of many devices, the man whose mind worked around problems when force could not go through them. He had tried to avoid the war, feigning madness, plowing his fields with a mixture of animals inappropriate for it, sowing them with salt. Polymedes had called his bluff by placing Odysseus's infant son in the path of the plow, and Odysseus had turned the plow aside, revealing that his madness was a performance, and came to Troy hating Polymedes for it, a hatred that would have consequences. Diomedes was there, the great Argive warrior who would wound the gods themselves in battle and not be cursed for it, who would stand with Odysseus in the most dangerous missions and prove himself the most reliable of allies. Ajax the Greater was there, massive and indomitable, whose strength was the second greatest on the field after Achilles, whose simple and absolute courage was the bedrock on which the Greek line rested in its worst moments. Ajax the Lesser, another warrior of great skill and lesser character, who would bring ruin on himself through a single act of sacrilege at the very moment of victory. And on the Trojan side there was Hector. This is important, and the Greeks knew it was important, which is why the Iliad, Homer's great poem of the war, makes Hector as fully human as Achilles, perhaps more so. Hector was Troy's greatest warrior, the son of Priam and Hecuba, the older brother of Paris, and he had not started this war and did not entirely approve of the reasons for it. He was a man who fought for his city, his family, the people he was responsible for, without the easy certainty of divine favor that the Greek heroes had. He was mortal in a cleaner, less complicated way than Achilles, no divine mother, no prophecies, no special weapons. Just his training and his courage and the deep human desire to protect what he loved. He had a wife, Andromache, and a small son, Astyanax, a baby who cried when his father put on the great crested helmet, frightened by the bronze and the horsehair plume, and Hector took the helmet off and laughed and lifted the child. And the scene is one of the most human things in all of ancient literature, a warrior father laughing at his son's fear of his war gear. All three of them held for a moment in a circle of love that everyone who has ever read it has recognized immediately as the most fragile and the most precious kind of thing there is. The war lasted 10 years. 10 years of fighting on the plain before the walls of Troy, 10 years of dying, 10 years of the specific suffering that long wars produce, not just the battles, but the waiting between them, the homesickness, the arguments, the petty politics of a camp where everyone's importance is constantly being measured and remeasured. The gods divided themselves too. Hera and Athena were on the Greek side, nursing their resentment over the judgment of Paris. Aphrodite was on the Trojan side, protecting Paris as best she could, though she was not a goddess of war and her interventions sometimes made things worse. Apollo stood with Troy. Poseidon, for complex divine reasons, stood with the Greeks. The war was not decided by the battles. That is what the stories teach. The battles went back and forth, neither side gaining a decisive advantage, because the Trojans were behind their walls, which were unbreachable, and the Greeks had their fleet at their backs, and neither side could quite destroy the other. What changed things were the choices people made, the great decisions and the great mistakes, the moments when pride or grief or anger overrode everything else. The most important of these was Achilles. In the 10th year of the war, Agamemnon and Achilles quarreled. Agamemnon had taken a captive woman as his prize, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Apollo had sent plague into the Greek camp in punishment. The Greeks persuaded Agamemnon to return her, and Agamemnon, furious at being made to give up his prize, took instead Briseis, the captive woman who had been given to Achilles. It was an assertion of power, a reminder of the hierarchy of command, and it was also a profound insult to the greatest warrior in the camp. Achilles did not kill Agamemnon. He wanted to, and the only thing that stopped him was Athena, who came and whispered in his ear that if he withdrew instead, if he chose a different kind of revenge, the outcome would be better. He withdrew. He went his ship and he stopped fighting, and he sent his divine mother Thetis to Zeus with a request. Let the Trojans win, let the Greeks suffer, let Agamemnon understand what it meant to have dishonored the man who had been making his victories possible. Zeus agreed. The Trojans surged forward. The Greeks, who had held the plain and sometimes pressed to the very walls of Troy, were now pushed back to their ships. Men died who should not have died, in engagements that should not have happened, because the man who would have prevented those engagements was sitting on the beach, watching the war he had withdrawn from with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but something in between, something complicated. His best friend Patroclus watched the Greeks dying and could not stand it any longer. He went to Achilles and asked for his armor, the famous armor, divinely made, that every Trojan on the field recognized, and Achilles let him take it, and let him lead the Myrmidons, Achilles' men, back into the battle. The plan was simple, a shock attack, drive the Trojans back from the ships, and then pull back before going too far. But Patroclus went too far. He drove the Trojans back across the plain, he pushed all the way to the walls of Troy, and Hector was there. And Apollo, who had been watching, struck Patroclus on the back of the head, stunning him, and his helmet fell and his spear shattered, and he stood on the field unprotected, and Euphorbus wounded him, and Hector finished it. Patroclus fell. The news was brought to Achilles, and the world stopped. The grief Achilles felt was beyond anything the Iliad tries to describe in full, because some griefs are too complete for description. He cried out and tore his hair and pressed his face into the dirt, and his mother Thetis came up from the sea at his sound, unable to stay away, unable to not come when her son was in that kind of pain. He told her what had happened, and she held him, and she told him what she had always known, that if he went back into the war to avenge Patroclus, he would kill Hector, and then he would die. His death was bound to Hector's. The two were joined by fate in a way that could not be separated. He went back to the war. He went back not because he had calculated the outcomes and found the balance tipped in favor of return. He went back because Patroclus was dead and Hector was alive, and no consideration of survival or fate or Thetis's tears could change the simple and absolute fact that he could not do anything other than what he was going to do. His mother had new armor made for him by Hephaestus, a blazing shield with the whole world pictured on it, the sky and the ocean and the cities of men and the fields and the harvest and the wedding and the funeral, all of it there, contained in the bronze circle that he would carry into his last great battle. He met Hector outside the walls of Troy. They had circled the city first, Hector running, because even Hector, who had never run from anything, could not stand his ground against Achilles in this particular fury. But they met, and Athena deceived Hector into thinking he had an ally at his side, and Hector turned to fight, and they fought. It was not long. Achilles killed Hector with a spear through the throat, and Hector fell, and with his last breath he told Achilles what was coming. Paris and Apollo will kill you, and you will fall at Troy, not long after me. And Achilles said, yes, and did not flinch. What followed was the most disturbing thing Achilles did, and the Iliad does not excuse it. He tied Hector's body to his chariot by the heels and drove around the walls of Troy, dragging the body in the dust, past the gate where Priam and Hecuba were watching, where Andromache was watching, past the place where Troy's hope had stood and now was dragged behind a chariot in the dust. He drove around the walls for days. Apollo protected the body from actual defilement, kept the skin whole, kept the face recognizable, preserved the dignity that Achilles was trying to destroy. And Zeus watched, and sent Thetis to Achilles, and sent Hermes to guide old Priam through the Greek camp in secret, and Priam came to Achilles in the night. An old man, alone except for Hermes in his guise as a young helper, walking into the tent of the man who had killed his greatest son. He knelt before Achilles and he said, I have done what no father should do. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my children. Give me back my son to bury. And Achilles, who had lost his friend, who had driven himself into a grief so complete that it had become a kind of destruction, Achilles looked at this old man and saw his own father, far away in Phthia, old and waiting for a son who would not come home. He wept. They wept together, the old Trojan king and the young Greek hero, each grieving for what the war had cost them, and Achilles gave back the body, and the truce was held, and Hector was burned on his funeral pyre while Troy grieved. And then the truce ended, and the war continued, and shortly after, an arrow from Paris's bow, guided by Apollo, found the one vulnerable place on Achilles's immortal body, his heel, which his mother had held when she dipped him in the Styx, and which had therefore never been touched by the divine water. The greatest warrior who had ever lived fell from an arrow in the heel, guided by a god, shot by a man not known for his courage. Fate is rarely dignified in the way we think it should be. Ajax carried the body from the field while Odysseus held off the Trojans. They saved Achilles from being taken. His armor became the subject of a contest between Ajax and Odysseus, and when Odysseus won it through the eloquence of his argument, Ajax was consumed by a madness of shame. In the madness, he slaughtered a herd of cattle, thinking he was killing the Greek leaders who had dishonored him, and when the madness cleared and he saw what he had done, the shame was absolute, and Ajax, the man who had never broken and never fled and had been the immovable foundation of the Greek army for 10 years, killed himself on his sword. The war required more than force. It required strategy, cunning, the specific intelligence that Odysseus carried like a weapon he was always ready to deploy. He and Diomedes went on night raids. They stole the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena that protected Troy, from within the city walls. They captured the Trojan prophet Helenus and learned from him the conditions under which Troy could be taken, conditions that included bringing Achilles' son Neoptolemus and Philoctetes with his bow. Philoctetes had been left on the island of Lemnos 10 years before, at the beginning of the war, because a wound on his foot had become infected and his cries of pain had disrupted the sacrifices. He had spent 10 years alone on that island with his bow and his wound and his absolute hatred of the Greeks who had abandoned him. When Odysseus came to him, the hatred was undiminished. But the prophecy was clear, and eventually, with Achilles' son Neoptolemus acting as the more honest face of the embassy, and Heracles himself appearing in vision to command it, Philoctetes came to Troy. His arrows were not missing. And then the horse. The great wooden horse, built by Epios under Athena's direction, hollow, large enough to contain warriors inside, the most famous trick in the history of warfare, the image that has become the symbol of strategic deception for all time. The Greeks loaded the best fighters into the belly of the horse, Odysseus among them, and Neoptolemus and Menelaus and others, and then they sailed their ships away, not far, just behind the nearby island of Tenedos, and left the horse on the beach. The Trojans came out in the morning and found the empty beach, the abandoned camp, and the horse. What it meant was debated. Cassandra cried out that it was a trap, that there were men inside, that bringing it into the city would destroy Troy. No one listened. The seer Laocoon threw a spear at it and said it was dangerous, and then he and his 2 sons were killed by sea serpents sent by Poseidon, and the Trojans interpreted this as a divine sign that Laocoon had been wrong to doubt. They brought the horse inside the walls of Troy. They celebrated their apparent victory, the departure of the Greeks, the end of 10 years of war. They celebrated through the night, and when the celebration was over and the city slept, the trapdoor in the horse's belly opened, and the warriors climbed down, and they opened the gates for the army that had sailed back under cover of darkness, and Troy fell. The fall was complete and brutal. Priam, who had ruled Troy for so long, was killed at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, who had his father's force, but not his father's ability to feel the weight of what he was doing. Cassandra was dragged from the temple where she had taken sanctuary, an act of sacrilege against Athena that the goddess would not forget. Andromache's son Astyanax, the baby who had cried at the sight of his father's helmet, was thrown from the walls of Troy, because the Greeks feared that if a son of Hector lived, he would one day come back for revenge. Andromache herself was taken as a slave. The women of Troy were distributed as prizes. Hecuba, who had been queen of the greatest city in the world, who had borne 50 sons and watched most of them die, who had seen her husband killed at his own altar and her grandson thrown from the walls, Hecuba was given to Odysseus. The transformation from queen to slave, from the highest position to the lowest, accomplished in a single night, through the mechanism of a wooden horse and a door opened in the dark. Helen was found. Menelaus came for her with his sword drawn, with 10 years of humiliation and death behind him, ready to kill her, and then he saw her, and the sword was lowered. And what happened in that moment between them is something the stories have never quite been willing to explain. They went home to Sparta, and they grew old there together, and whether it was love or habit or simply the overwhelming weight of what it would take to choose differently, this is left, as the Greeks often leave the most important questions, to the contemplation of each individual who hears the story. The gods punish the Greeks for the sacrilege of the fall, for the violations of the temples, the murders at the altars, the dishonor shown to the holy places of Troy. The storm that Athena sent against the Greek fleet returning home scattered them across the Mediterranean, killed many, drove others far off course. Ajax the Lesser, who had committed the worst sacrilege, died in the storm, his ship wrecked on rocks, and he scrambled to safety on a great boulder and shouted that he had survived despite the gods, and Poseidon, who had heard, took the boulder and broke it under him, and Ajax was swallowed by the sea. Menelaus was blown to Egypt and was wandering for years before reaching home. Agamemnon reached home only to be killed by his wife Clytemnestra, who had spent the 10 years of the war nursing her hatred of him, hatred for many things, but most completely for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis. When the fleet was becalmed and Agamemnon had agreed to sacrifice his daughter to Artemis for favorable winds. Clytemnestra had not forgiven this, would never have forgiven this, and she had taken a lover in Agamemnon's absence, Aegisthus, a cousin with his own reasons to hate the house of Atreus, and together they killed the king in his bath, in his own palace, on his first night home. The blood of that killing called for more blood. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, was told by Apollo that he must avenge his father's murder, which meant killing his mother. He killed her. The Furies, who were the specific avengers of family blood, pursued him across the world for the murder of a mother, a crime so fundamental that even the act commanded by Apollo could not escape their attention. The trial of Orestes in Athens, before the court of the Areopagus, with Athena presiding and Apollo arguing in his defense and the Furies demanding their right, this became the origin myth of human justice. The moment when the old cycle of blood vengeance was replaced by something that could assess the circumstances and the context and make a considered judgment rather than simply continuing the chain of killing. And Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, the man who had been gone from Ithaca for 20 years by the time the story of his wandering was fully told, 10 years at Troy and 10 years trying to get home. He lost his entire crew. He lost every ship but his own, and eventually he lost that too. He navigated past the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was Poseidon's son, and blinding Polyphemus gave Poseidon a specific and personal reason to work against him. He escaped the Lotus Eaters, who fed his men a flower that made them forget everything they had ever known or loved. He navigated past the Sirens, who sang with the voice of everything you had ever desired, lashed his mast so he could hear the singing without being able to leap into the sea to follow it. He spent a year with the goddess Circe on her island, and 7 years with the goddess Calypso, who loved him and kept him and would not let him go until Zeus sent Hermes with a direct command. He descended to the underworld, where he spoke with the shade of his dead comrades and with Achilles, who told him that he would rather be a living slave than the king of all the dead, and with Tiresias the blind prophet, who told him what he needed to know to reach home. He arrived home to find his wife Penelope beset by suitors, noble young men from all the islands who had concluded that Odysseus was dead and who were competing for Penelope's hand and his kingdom, eating through his household, exhausting his resources, treating his home as their extended court. Penelope had kept them at bay through her own cleverness. She had said she would choose a suitor when she finished weaving a funeral shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's father, and she had woven each day and unraveled each night for 3 years, until a disloyal servant revealed the trick. Odysseus came home disguised as a beggar. He was recognized by his old dog Argos, who wagged his tail and died. He was recognized by his nurse Euryclea, who saw a scar on his thigh while washing his feet and whom he swore to silence. He watched the suitors in his own hall and measured them and waited for his moment. Penelope announced that she would marry whichever suitor could string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined in a row. Not one of the suitors could string it. Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar, asked to try, and was laughed at and tried, and strung it, and shot the arrow through all 12 axes, and then turned the bow on the suitors. What followed was brief and total. Odysseus and his son Telemachus and 2 loyal servants against the full company of suitors, and the suitors, who had been comfortable and confident in their numbers, found that they were not fighting a beggar in a hall but Odysseus, the man who had survived everything, who had spent 20 years coming home to this specific moment and was not going to be stopped by a room full of young men who had been drinking his wine and eating his food and assuming he was dead. He killed them all. He had the disloyal servants hanged. He was reunited with Penelope, who tested him one final time, because she too was wise, because she had spent 20 years not being certain of anything, because trust had to be earned rather than assumed, even for a husband 20 years gone. The test of the bed he had built himself around a living olive tree that could not be moved from the room, that only he and she and one servant knew about. This was how she knew it was truly him. And the reunion was as hard won and as real as anything in the entire long tradition of Greek storytelling. And so the great age of heroes drew toward its close. The heroes themselves died, Troy had taken many of them, and those who survived Troy died in their homecomings or in the aftermaths of homecomings. The children of the heroes fought their own wars, briefer and less glorious. The world was slowly emptying of the extraordinary, the divine and semi-divine withdrawing from the human stage, the gods retreating to their Olympus and becoming less immediately present in human affairs, more distant, more abstract. less likely to appear on the road as an old woman or a young man offering crucial advice at the crucial moment. Heracles was on Olympus now. Perseus's children had founded their kingdoms and were ruling them with the ordinary complexities of mortal rule. Theseus had died in exile. Jason had died under his rotting ship. Orpheus, let us speak of Orpheus, because his story is perhaps the most beautiful and most terrible in all of Greek mythology, the one that says most clearly what the Greeks believed about the relationship between art and death, between love and loss, between the human capacity to reach past every limit and the limits that finally hold regardless. Orpheus was the son of the muse Calliope, and he received from Apollo, or was born with, a gift for music so extraordinary that it transcended the ordinary categories of skill. When Orpheus played his lyre and sang, the rivers stopped their courses. Trees uprooted themselves and walked to where he was, to stand in his audience. Wild animals gathered around him in peace. Rocks cracked along their grain lines, as if responding to something deep in the music that the inorganic world could feel. He sailed with the Argonauts, and when they passed the island of the Sirens, whose singing lured sailors to their deaths, Orpheus played and sang against them, and his music was louder and more beautiful than the Sirens' song, and the crew rowed past in safety. Some of them weeping not at the Sirens' voices, but at Orpheus's. He loved a woman named Eurydice, and they were married, and on their wedding day a serpent bit her heel as she walked in the grass, and she died. She died on the day she was married, before the garlands had wilted, before the wedding guests had gone home. And Orpheus, who had played music that moved mountains, stood over her body and found that none of his gifts could do anything about this. He went down to the underworld. He went with his lyre and nothing else, through the entrance to the land of the dead, past the dark river and the waiting ferryman and the three-headed dog, playing as he went, and everything that heard him stopped. Charon was moved. Cerberus was moved. The shades of the dead, who felt nothing, were moved. Tantalus stopped reaching for the fruit that moved away from him. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder and listened. The Furies, who had no tears, wept. The entire underworld fell silent around the sound of Orpheus playing. He stood before Hades and Persephone and played for them. He played everything, the love he had for Eurydice and the grief of the loss and the hope, the small and desperate hope, that the rules might be different this one time. He asked for her back. Just this once, just for one life, let the rule bend. Persephone was weeping. Hades's iron face was not iron. He said, "Yes. She can come back with you. There is one condition. You will walk ahead of her from the underworld to the upper air, and she will follow, and you must not turn back to look at her until you are both out of the darkness. If you look before she is fully in the light, she goes back and does not come again." Orpheus walked. He could hear her behind him. He thought, the faint sound of movement, the sense of a presence, and then perhaps not, perhaps nothing, perhaps silence, and the silence was too much. The silence was the worst thing, because it could mean she was there, and he simply couldn't hear her, or it could mean she had been taken back already, or it could mean he was walking toward the light alone, and he would never know which it was unless he turned to look. He turned. She was there. She was behind him, one step from the boundary, one step from being fully in the light, and he saw her for a moment, just for a moment, the face he loved, and then she was pulled back, drawn back into the dark. And the second time he heard her voice it was saying goodbye, and then she was gone. He tried to go back down. Charon would not carry him. The entrance was closed to him. He sat on the banks of the river and played for 7 days, and nothing responded except the birds. He wandered for years afterward, playing, unable to stop, unable to be around people, unwilling to love anyone else. The Maenads, the wild women who followed Dionysus in his ecstatic processions, came upon him in Thrace and tore him apart with their bare hands when he would not join their worship. His head was thrown into the river Hebrus, and it floated downstream, still singing, still calling out for Eurydice, until it reached the island of Lesbos, where it was preserved and became an oracle. What does the story of Orpheus mean? The Greeks did not leave explicit instructions. But it means, among other things, that love is the force that moves the world in ways that nothing else can, and that loss is real, and that even the greatest gifts cannot protect you from the specific pain of losing the person you cannot live without. It means that the human capacity to reach past every boundary, past death, past the rules that govern everything else, is real, and that it is also, sometimes, just barely not enough. He almost made it. He was one step away. And the fact that he was so close makes it worse, not better, and the Greeks knew this, and they made Orpheus's story the story of how close you can be and still fail, which is one of the most honest things anyone has ever said about how the world works. The age was ending. Troy was ash and rubble. Mycenae, which Agamemnon had ruled, fell to the Dorians within a generation. The great palace civilizations of the Greek world, the wide-ruled, richly decorated, deeply interconnected cultures of the Bronze Age, went dark as if the Age of Heroes had used up something that could not be replaced. There was a period the Greeks themselves called the Dark Ages, when the writing systems were lost, when the trade networks collapsed, when the great palaces stood empty and their roofs fell in and the grass grew up through the floors, when the memory of what had been was preserved only in the songs that people sang around their fires. But they did not forget. They never forgot. Across 2 or 3 centuries of darkness, in the mouths of blind poets and traveling singers, the stories survived. They survived because they contained something people needed, a record of the heights that human beings had reached, the gods they had spoken to, the wars they had fought, the monsters they had defeated, the loves that had carried them to the end of the world and beyond. They survived because in a world that had lost its grandeur, the memory of grandeur was the thing that kept people from believing that smallness was the permanent condition of humanity. And when the light came back, when the Greeks rebuilt their cities, invented their alphabet, sailed their ships across the same waters where the Argonauts had sailed, founded their colonies, developed their philosophy and their theater and their democracy, the stories came with them renewed, reconsidered, given new forms and new voices. Homer sang the Iliad and the Odyssey with a clarity and a power that has never been matched. Hesiod organized the chaos of divine genealogy into the Theogony. The tragedians took the old stories and pressed them until they yielded everything, every drop of moral and emotional truth that they contained. And the stories were not finished. They would never be entirely finished. Every culture that encountered them found in them something recognizable, something that spoke to their own experience of being human in a world governed by forces they could not fully understand or control. The Romans took them and renamed them and added their own dimension. The Renaissance rediscovered them and made them new again. The Romantic poets found in them the full weight of the sublime. The modern world has never stopped returning to them, finding in the stories of gods and heroes and monsters some vocabulary for what it feels like to be small and mortal in a universe that is neither small nor, in any comfortable sense, moral. Because this is the deepest gift of Greek mythology. Not the stories themselves, magnificent as they are. Not the gods, with all their complicated personalities. Not the heroes, with all their impossible feats. The deepest gift is the framework, the set of questions that the stories ask, over and over, from chaos to the ash of Troy and beyond. What is a person owed by the world? What is power due to the one who holds it? Is suffering meaningful, or is it simply suffering? Can love survive the specific form of loss that comes from loving across the boundary between the mortal and the immortal? What does it mean to choose when the choice is already made? What is the relationship between what you deserve and what you get? These questions do not have easy answers. The Greeks knew this. Their gods were not models of righteousness. Their heroes were not paragons of virtue. The universe their stories described was not arranged for human convenience, did not operate according to a principle of fairness that the human mind would recognize as fair. But it was a universe of consequence, a universe where choices mattered, where the person you were in the moment of decision was revealed, and where that revelation was preserved, in story and carried forward, and continued to mean something even after the person was gone. This is the victory over time that mythology offers. Not immortality in the literal sense, not the endless life that Tithonus asked for and was given and grew old within, his flesh wasting while his life continued, until he was nothing but a grasshopper chirping in a box. Not the cold and perfect preservation of the bronze statue or the carved stone, but the specific immortality of meaning, the quality of a story that keeps being told because it keeps being true, because each new generation hears it and recognizes something of themselves inside it, because the questions it asks are the questions that do not go away. Prometheus is still on his rock, in a sense. Every person who has ever given up something they valued for the sake of something they believed in has felt, in some corner of themselves, the pressure of that rock and the shadow of that eagle, and the choice they are making again each morning. Orpheus walks ahead of us every time we choose, and behind him the thing we love most, and the instruction not to look back, and the terrible difficulty of knowing whether the silence means presence or absence, and the choosing, always the choosing, between trust and certainty, between the willingness to continue and the need to know. Achilles sits at his ships and nurses his pride and his grief until Patroclus is dead, and that grief becomes the instrument of his return, and his return becomes the instrument of his death. And his death becomes the most famous death in the history of literature. And we recognize him. We recognize the paralysis of wounded dignity, and the way that we sometimes cannot act until we have lost something more precious than what we were protecting, and the way that grief can finally move us when pride cannot. Persephone walks upward through the dark, toward the light, and behind her the sound of the world below growing quieter, and ahead of her the first pale intimation of day. She is going home, and she will have to leave again, and she will go home again after that. The cycle will not stop. Loss and return, winter and spring, the world going cold and the world coming back, on and on, as long as the world turns. And in that cycle, in the image of the goddess ascending, and the earth greening around her as she rises, there is a promise. Not a promise that loss will not come again, only the promise that it has not been the final word yet. And Gaia, the earth herself, first thing after chaos, the foundation of everything that ever happened, still lies beneath all of it, still feeling every footstep, every impact, every planting and every harvest and every war, patient and immeasurable and enduring. The original and the ongoing, the thing that was there at the very beginning and will be there after the last of the stories has been told and the last fire has gone out and the last human voice has stopped. Before the silence, there was chaos. And from chaos came everything: the earth and the sky and the sea and the darkness and the light, and the titans and the Olympians, and the heroes and the monsters, and the fires lit in caves and the ships that crossed the wine-dark sea, and the bow of Odysseus and the armor of Achilles and the sandals with wings and the lyre that stopped rivers and the wooden horse that unmade a city and the 6 seeds of pomegranate and the jar with hope at the bottom. All of it. All of this. From chaos came the world. And the world, in all its difficulty and all its beauty, was worth the telling.